My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Jerry Murray. It's December 11th, 2025. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
First question is, why wine?
Why wine? So for me, wine, at one point in my life, I was an aspiring academic. So I worked in the sciences, and with the, that side of the brain, I don't know if it's the left or right, became very well developed. And at some point, I realized that that academia in me was a square peg in a round hole situation, and that I wanted to make something. I wanted something that could be shown at the end of the day. And so, I moved to New Orleans to learn a trade, stonework, ironwork, something like that. Ended up working in kitchens and realized those guys work with their hands. That's a craft as well. And I was working in kitchens, traveling really all over the country, working in kitchens around the country. And I ended up in Tucson, Arizona. And at that time, I was working at a restaurant called Fuego, and we would do wine dinners about every 6 weeks during the peak tourist season. And so working to develop these menus, I developed an interest in wine. And Pinot Noir stuck to me right away. And so I moved to Oregon, sort of not with the intention of getting in the wine business, but thinking maybe it's a possibility. And when I got here, I realized that wine wasn't something that happened far away. It was something that happened very close by. And I begged my way into a wine job. And what I realized was that the sciences were too one-sided of the brain, cooking was too the other side of the brain, and winemaking was a good balance of the two. The other thing that I liked about it were the timelines. And so with academia, between coming up with an idea and funding it, collecting the data, analyzing the data, publishing the work, could be, sometimes close to a decade. And that timeline didn't appeal to me. And then kitchens, the timeline is 8 minutes. And that didn't really appeal to me either. So I wanted something that sort of struck a balance between those. And so it became pretty clear to me during my first harvest that wine was it.
Excellent. All right, let's back up for a second. Talk about life before all of that. Tell us about where you're born and raised and kind of path into school.
So I'm from Ohio. I lived in Ohio for my first 27 years. Grew up in a rural community, agricultural community, spent my summers, baling hay and pitching shit. And, which never thought that would be a useful skill until I got into wine. I was like, all right, there we go. It was full circle. And then I went to the university, Ohio University. Originally, I wanted to be a coach. I was a track and field athlete. Well, I should back that up. I was a field athlete. I was not a track athlete, and wanted to get into coaching. So I started out in sort of applied exercise physiology, and then my love of the sciences became considerably greater than my desire to be a coach. And I got suspended from the track team for insubordination, which this might turn out to play out as a theme throughout this interview. And so I said, and the other thing that occurred to me, that even if I were the best discus thrower in the world, it's still doomed to a life of poverty. So this isn't how I should spend my time. So I decided then to go ahead and get further into the sciences. And so I started to study physiology with an emphasis in skeletal muscle. And I was really fascinated by that. I ended up going to graduate school at Ohio University as well. And there I was working with some rat mussels from a shuttle mission. And eventually I realized the square peg round hole. And then I took a teaching position at the medical school there, the College of Osteopathic Medicine. For a couple years, I taught anatomy there. And then it was time, and through that process, I determined I wanted to work with my hands. And then, like all great stories, I followed a girl. And she was working in New Orleans, so I moved to New Orleans to work with her. It was funny, originally I was going to go to massage school, and it just occurred to me, like, who's going to pay you to give them a massage? And so I was like, okay, we're not going to do that. So let's find a trade, and then it ended up being cooking.
So tell me about getting into cooking and about, tell me about your start. What was the first thing you did?
So actually, the first job I had in New Orleans was, working for a stone crew with a guy that I refer to as Big Jim Black. He talked like Foghorn Leghorn. And I received a very rapid education on, the Civil War. For me, it's something that happened a long time ago. There was still this Yankee thing going on, and so I became acutely aware of my northernness and a lot of other things. And I made it for about 2 weeks with Jim. I'd get paid in cash in front of headlights in abandoned lots, and I was, I either feel like I'm going to end up in jail or shot. So I decided to find a different job, and I got a job delivering sandwiches on a bicycle in downtown New Orleans during lunch. And that was pretty exciting. I had spent the previous summer rock climbing, so I was into adrenaline, and just the highest point in the city of New Orleans is the Monkey Hill at Audubon Park, and so there was really nothing exciting. So riding a bike in downtown New Orleans proved to be just that. And so I was working at the restaurant doing that, and then I would also bus, and then I started to see the guys in the kitchen, and I was like, okay, that's a trade. And so I developed some resolve. I was going to ask the owner of the restaurant if I could move into the kitchen. So January 2nd, I go into work, and there was a meeting going on, and it was a very somber sort of environment, and everybody was already there. And turns out one of the owners forced the other owner out, and they'd fired a bunch of people. They'd brought a bunch of new people in, and they were like, hey, we tried to get a hold of you. We want to let you know. We hope you'll stay. We think you do a good job. And I was like, well, I want to work in the kitchen. And she was like, well, I need somebody that has experience to do that. I'm like, okay, well, you can give me the experience. And she was like, well, I just don't think that's going to work. And I said, okay, well, I'll go somewhere where it will, So she said, okay. So I got into the kitchen, spent a little time working with the bakers, became the baker, realized very quickly that I'm not a very good baker. Everybody realized that. In fact, I think everybody else realized it before I did, but then it became very clear. And then one day, one of the guys on the line walks out, which happens a lot in New Orleans, and just walks out during service, and they were like, hey, we need you up here. And so I got up on I was working the cold station, and it clicked, it fit, and the chef was like, I want you up here. And I was like, I heard you were going to fire me, and I came in today to give you notice, but I'll give you 2 weeks, and I'll spend them working this station. And so he's like, all right. And he talked me into staying, so I stayed for a while. And then I left New Orleans. I moved to Hyco, West Virginia, to work at a restaurant at a rafting company for the summer.
What was it that clicked about cooking?
I liked the action. So there was that speed. There was also the creative aspect, at first it was really it was visual. The creativity was a visual, making something look physically appealing. And I've always been into skill acquisition. So, developing knife skills, developing the physical manual skills, which also was something that really attracted me to wine as well. And then as I progressed in the kitchens, it becoming more of a cerebral, the creativity being cerebral. And not only that, but there's a technical aspect to things. And so the science aspect of me wasn't completely obliterated. It was still there. It was just, it was less pure and more of an applied scenario. And so I think that's what really clicked. I also I've always been interested in extreme characters, like raft guides, rock climbers, traveling winemakers, but also kitchens, so I like misfits. I kind of am one. And so I liked the environment. I liked the people as well. And, at the time I liked the hours, but I like I like, I'm not a man of leisure. I like to be moving. And so the kitchen appealed to that as well.
So you talked about wine sort of entering a little bit later when you get into Tucson. Tell me about in the path between that. What were the kind of the notable moments for you, or the goals attained in your cooking career? Were there certain places you worked or certain roles you had that were memorable or meaningful?
Definitely. So, I spent some time in Hyco, West Virginia. That wasn't one of those situations. It was interesting, but it certainly wasn't a springboard for my career or anything like that. The girl who I had followed to New Orleans, when I went to West Virginia, she went to Tucson. And so she had been asking around because she knew I wanted to cook. And she asked one of her patients, who was a retired chef, who should he work for? And he said, Alan Zeman. And so when I get to New Orleans, I get my resume up, I go eat at Fuego, and I say, this is the guy I want to work for. I go in the next day, said I came in last night, I ate, here's my resume. The head chef interviews me, and he's like, all right, well, I'll have to bring you back to talk to Kent, the chef de cuisine. And I talked to Kent, and they were like, all right, you're hired. And that was the only job I applied for in Tucson. And that was sort of a chef. And the interesting thing about Alan, everybody in town called him chef. He had worked at the hotels. There was a very well-developed apprenticeship program in Tucson at the time. And so chefs at other restaurants referred to Alan as chef. And so it was, and it was because he taught, and the deal was, you learn the things that you don't need to do for this job on your own time. So if I was willing to stay later, come in early, I could learn to do charcuterie, make sausages, make pâtés, things like that. And so it was a learning environment that was only limited by the amount of time I was willing to put in, which I was willing to put in a lot of time. And so that was really sort of, an inflection point for me. And then when I moved to Portland, I worked at Wildwood. That was the job I got. I applied to several places, interviewed at several. I either wanted to work in a highly technical kitchen. At that time, the molecular gastronomy was evolving. Either there wasn't a lot of that going on in Portland, or I wanted to work with somebody that was extremely seasonally focused. I saw those were like the two directions that your pillars of like great cuisine. And Wildwood was definitely, a farmer-driven, agricultural-driven site. And so, I took the job at Wildwood, and I was there for about 18 months before moving on to work my first harvest.
So tell me about before getting into harvest, you mentioned kind of wine education coming through winemaker dinners and exploration. Tell me about your process of learning wine, both learning sort of your palate and learning about the world of wine. What struck you about it? What were the ways you learned about it? What was interesting about?
Well, I think, it would be interesting to ask me that question at the time, because now when I look back, I have a completely different answer. I don't know what it would have been at that time. But I think for me, there was something there was the experience of beauty. Like, great wines is the experience of beauty. And I wouldn't have articulated that in 2000. That was something that became clear to me. That's what it was as I look back and this evolved. But it was the experience of beauty. And for me, in terms of red wines, Pinot Noir was the grape. It was. I often describe myself not as a winemaker who became a Pinot Noir lover. I was a Pinot Noir lover who became a winemaker. And so I think it was that, and it was this vastness, a lot like academia, where like skeletal muscle, there was a million directions we could go to with just like that idea. And I felt wine was the same way, that there was, and my interest was, this is lifelong learning. I'm infinitely curious, and so that this will never grow old, and to this date it hasn't. But I think that was part of the interest, and it tasted good, and it was fun. It's like at the end of the day, if you're a lawyer and you take your work home, that kind of sucks. if you're in wine and you take your work home, it's kind of fun.
So tell me about the first harvest, 2001.
So 2001, I have to tell a story of how I got that position. It was May 7th of 2001. I was working at Wildwood, and a friend that I had worked with there had taken a job out at the Bay House when it was out on the coast as a sous chef, and their wine guy had lined up a tour for some of their best customers and their cooks to do a tour of the valley, and he said, hey, why don't you join us? And so that day I met David Lett, I met Terry Castile, and I met Steve Dorner. And, like a lot of people are like, when did you think, it's like, to me, it was like May 7th, 2001, I want to be a winemaker. So after that, I started calling up all the favorite wineries, the wines that I tasted, talked to Steve. Steve, do you have experience? No, I don't. Oh, you should talk to Erath. So after hearing this 10 different times, I decided to go to Erath. So I call up, and Tyson Crowley was the assistant winemaker at the time, and Tyson's like, well, come on by, bring a resume. And so I went out to, I kind of dressed up a little bit, about like I am now. This is kind of dressed up for me. And I took my resume, I handed it to him, and I didn't think he looked at it. He just rolled it up, put it under his arms, and Rob Stewart was a winemaker at the time, so we're in the cellar, and Tyson's kind of giving me a tour of the cellar as if it were an orientation. It was kind of an awkward interview, and this is probably like July, maybe late June. And so, Rob walks by, and Tyson's like, hey, Rob, this guy's interested in a harvest position. So Rob looks at me, he says, you know how to work a shovel? Back to the, we go back to the work in New Orleans on the Stone Crew. Yeah, I know how to work a shovel. And he said, how's your back? And I said, it's fine. He says, yeah, go ahead. So that was it. So Tyson's like, all right, we'll start. I think the start date was September 20th. It was the 18th. It was 1 week after 9/11, which was sort of an interesting time for the wine, well, the entire world, but the wine industry, there was a sense of desperation, which turns out to be a cyclic thing, we're finding. Yeah, and so I started that job. So it was interesting, and I love that story. And Maria Stewart, who I have to tell the story of meeting Maria. So, it's my third day at Erath during harvest. They send me up to go to the photocopier to photocopy something, so I show up. And so I walk in, and I'm like, can you show me where the photocopier is? And Maria's like, yeah, sure. So she takes me over, and so I put something on it, and I print something off, and she's like, okay, well, the other one's upstairs. And I'm like, okay. So we go up. And so I said, okay, thanks. And she was like, well, don't you need to see if this works? And I was like, she's like, aren't you here to fix the copying machine? And I'm like, no, I'm working down in the cellar. And she was like, oh. And so that developed a lifelong relationship with Maria. We both had the same birthday. So, the Stewarts have been important, talk about mentorship. Rob has always been very encouraging with my career. Those early days at Erath were very interesting. That's when Dick still owned it. And yeah.
So what are your memories of that first harvest, and what was it that made you want to continue that kind of work?
Lots of, it's like harvest that first year was essentially one memory because it was all a blur. I would say the Erath facility at that time was a 450 ton facility. We put 850 tons through it, and so and for me that was a great experience. I didn't know it at the time, but in hindsight, seeing that, how do you exceed the capacity? Because if you're below capacity, from a business standpoint, it's not making any sense. So you always want to be at capacity or above capacity. Above capacity has a set of challenges, and Rob Stewart handled them extremely well. So seeing that, and only in hindsight did I see the brilliance of that. But it was, it was a lot of sort of crazy, a lot of long days. And what I liked about Erath at that time was that there was no you don't know how to do this yet. So, like we're doing some bottling, and Tyson's like, hey, you ever drive a forklift? I'm like, no. And he's like, all right, up, down, left, right. They're really heavy, don't hit anything. Go load that truck. So I'm driving this thing, loading a truck full of wine. I don't know how to drive the forklift. I'm not getting things on straight. The truck driver's yelling at me. Stop oversteering. And so that became a mantra for my life, is stop oversteering. And it became part of the winemaking philosophy too, stop oversteering. And I learned that from the cranky truck driver that was trying to get all this wine on a truck, which is difficult to do when you don't put it on straight. And so that truck pulls off, and another one pulls up that I have to unload. And so Erath was like that. It was you were in the crucible the whole time. For me, I like being in environments where I feel like I'm treading water poorly. And Erath was like that. So the things that you might have to have 3 vintages under your belt before you get to do at another winery, you do at Erath, your 3rd day. And so it was great in that regard. The tonnage, you got to see a lot of stuff, and you got to do the manual skills. And so small wineries, there are things you might do twice a year. At Erath, you might do them 6 times a day for 3 months. And so the manual skills, developing that was really interesting. But there was, I remember there was one day, it was, it turned out to be like an 18-hour day. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm soaking wet, it's freezing. And I just remember thinking, hell yeah. Everything I had done up until that point was leading me there. It was the science, agriculture, and cooking. And in fact, it was Steve Dorner that said, the winemaker is half chef, half scientist. And I added half farmer. So half farmer, half scientist, half chef. That's the kind of math I do. Yeah. And so, yeah, it was very much about that. And then it was also, that heavy year, and seeing how, in hindsight, I don't think we would consider 2001 a great vintage, but it was like, how do you deal with that? Like seeing winemakers respond to difficult vintages is education. Again, that's part of the crucible, and seeking out those opportunities, and and seeking out climates where it's just inherently hard. So I think for the advice I give to younger winemakers is, or aspiring winemakers, is go do jobs that aren't the job you want. Go to the big wineries, go to the small, crappy wineries, go to regions that are dealing with grapes and climates that you don't want to deal with, because that'll all inform what you do later on.
Compared to your expectations of winemaking, how did your first harvest fit?
I really had, that's a great question. I, came in thinking that wine was made by guys in polo shirts and deck shoes. And then I realized that wine gets made because guys use shovels and forklifts. And so it became really apparent that there was this juxtaposition between this elegant, refined, haute beverage, and just sort of the chaos and engineering and just grit it took to produce it. And so, and that I think for me, that was a big part of it, was like, I love sort of like living between these two worlds, like agriculture, farming, and factory work, and art. And so for me, it was very appealing.
So what came next after that harvest?
I did another harvest at Erath, so they kept telling me it's a temporary position. And come December, they're like, hey, can you stay to January? I'm like, yeah. And so January, hey, can you stay through February? I said, yeah. And they're like, can you stay through March? And I'm like, you got to give me a job. And they're like, all right. So they gave me a job. And so I stayed through 2002, and there was a transition at that time. New general manager had came in, Steve Volstek had moved in. And Rob had left to start R. Stewart and Company, and Michael Beckley, who at the time was the chef de cave at Druin, that's what they call cellar masters, they can't just call it a cellar master. Chef de cave, he came over and took over at Erath. So And so it was interesting being in the same facility with sort of a new head, a new mind. And Tyson had moved on, and so we'd made some changes to the cellar crew. For the most part, it was the same cellar crew. So I stayed through ERAF for that second harvest, 2002. Very different vintage, different set of challenges, and a more moderate yield. So it was sort of funny teasing Michael Beckley. At one point, there were some barrels that we had set aside, and at that time, ERAF, like Dick, there were barrels older than cellar people, really old barrels. And there were a bunch of them we had set out back, and we were pulling bungs out of them and to put in newer barrels. And I was like, Michael, we're going to need those barrels. He's like, no, I did the tonnage math. I'm like, you work for Dick ERAF. And so at some point, we're prepping these barrels, and they were like fountains. We're trying to fill them up with water to swell them up. And that was back before steamers were really common and things. And so, it's just like, it was still ERAF, and so it was interesting. And, I think Dick was much more involved with that one since it was a new winemaker for him. And so getting to work more closely with Dick, there was one evening that really stuck out in my mind. It was towards the end of harvest, and I think it was a Sunday, and everybody was getting ready to leave, and I had like one more thing to do, clean something, and I was going to be out of there. And then Dick shows up, and he's got a 5-gallon bucket, and he's got like wine and lees on his chin, and he's like, taste this, And so I take the bucket and I tip it up, I take a taste, and it was Dolcetto. They made a small amount of Dolcetto. It was one of the last reds we picked. And I said, yeah, we should probably press that tomorrow. And he said, I'm thinking we press it today. And so I got to, Dick and I, we dug that tank out, just the two of us. So, working side by side with him. It was like this wine grandpa moment, and Dick, was always supportive of my career as well. So, 2002 was, and I knew I was going to leave ERAF at the end of that. And so, I got to lead the PM crew. So, I got to step up a little bit more in a leadership role. I got to work more closely with both Michael Beckley and with Dick as well.
So you said you knew you were going to leave at that point. So did you have your next thing in mind?
I had it in mind. I wanted to go to New Zealand. I didn't know exactly what it would be, and I did manage to piece that together and took off to New Zealand. So I think I finished up end of November, early December at ERAF, and then I think I may have done some. I'm not sure what I did. I think I did some catering until I took off to New Zealand.
Why was New Zealand the next step?
Because I'd worked with people from New Zealand in both of those vintages. At that time, it was very common for New Zealanders to come here, for us to go to New Zealand. And what I realized was that spending a year in a winery was that, the wine is really made during harvest, and the rest of it is we're just kind of, babysitting it, maintaining it. But the decision making, the vast majority of the decision making around winemaking happens during harvest. And that if I could do 2 or 3 harvests in a year, I could get 2 or 3 years of experience in one. And I liked the action, I liked working harvest. So the idea of getting 2 in a year, or even 3, eventually 3, was very appealing. So, so I started looking at that, and I forget how I got the Highfield gig. I think it was through Roberta Montero, who was a cooperage rep. She had, somehow I talked to her, and that got set up, and so I got to go work at Highfield Estate in 2003.
What was the experience like, and how did it differ from what you'd already done?
It was much more technical. It was probably about the same size, but it felt more boutique. So, Sauvignon Blanc was the vast majority of what we did, but we did do Pinot Noir, we did sparkling wine, we did Riesling, we did Chardonnay. And so it was much more white focused, which was part of the plan. I loved white wines, and I realized that in Oregon, for the most part, especially at that time, it was white wine was essentially Pinot Gris, and it was an afterthought oftentimes to red winemaking. And so I wanted to develop more refined white winemaking skills. So the trip to New Zealand, that was kind of the goal. That crew was really good to work with. You know, there was a very can-do attitude. It was sort of like, oh, hey guys, you know, it'll be the two of you here tonight. We got 80 tons coming in, so, you know, and it was like, well, that's impossible. All right, you know, and so we were ready to go at 6 a.m. when the other team, rolled in, and so I liked that. It was very thoughtful. Al Soper, the winemaker there, was a very thoughtful winemaker. His assistant, Sam Bennett, went off to be winemakers elsewhere. The cellar guy I worked with, Jeremy Brown, he went off to be a winemaker. So these were all, you know, there were no warm bodies on that team, and they all knew more than I did. They were all better than I was, and so that got to lift me up. We tasted a lot, so Al had a nice cellar. So not only did I get to taste a lot of current releases, but I got to taste library wines that he had, and just got to be immersed in it. And so when we would go out, you know, you go to the bar, you're hanging out with other winemakers, and I think, you know, I learned the value of the war story. We tend to think of it as, you know, like bragging, but the reality is that a lot of times these war stories are about mistakes, and I think, you know, there's this idea of anti-fragility, and a book recommendation, Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, but the idea is that the way I think about it is that the war story allows me to encounter a problem and a solution, either a solution that worked or didn't, without actually having to be invested. The more I can learn from other people's mistakes, the better off I am. So the war story, I mean, I have been in situations where I knew what to do, not because I had been there, but because somebody else had, and over beers, somebody was talking about it. And so, and there was a lot of that in New Orleans. There was a lot of drinking, in New Zealand. There was a lot of drinking and talking about wine in New Zealand. So I enjoyed that.
At that point, did you have a long-term goal or a career aspiration in mind? Did you have an idea what you wanted to get to?
I think by that third harvest in New Zealand, I knew I wanted to be a winemaker, and I suspected I eventually wanted the control, but I wasn't in a rush to get there. I think at that time, you know, there wasn't the proliferation of small wineries, and so, you know, there was the sense that you really had to know what you were doing before you launched a brand, and eventually I sort of came to realize that I didn't want to launch a brand until I had something to say, and it took me 19 vintages to sort of figure out what I wanted to say, but I knew I wanted to be a winemaker at that point, and so after that, it was about spending as much time as I could in that. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2003, there weren't a lot of assistant winemaker jobs. You know, it was much harder to find work in the wine industry than even internships were more difficult to come by than they are now. Intern now, like, we're starving for them. You know, there aren't enough people interested in doing the work. The other interesting thing is, at that time, you didn't need a degree. You know, you just needed to know what you were doing to be smart, and you could get the winemaking job. Whereas now, I think, there's just so many institutions that are providing winemaking education. There's just a proliferation of it, and so that might be changing. But at one point, I remember, you know, I used to give the advice, you don't need to get a degree in winemaking to be a winemaker. And then at some point, I changed my mind. I said, you probably should, just because everybody else has one. And so, but at that time, there were a handful of Davis guys here. Some of the Fresno State guys were just showing up, Steve Goff and Thomas Hausman. And then later after those guys, Chad Stock and Rinke, Dan Rinke, those guys were showing up. But, at that time in 2003, you could still get a winemaking job if there was one without a degree, but it was still hard. So my goal was to work in wine as much as I could, and that was the process of stringing together a bunch of, like the gig economy before it was the gig economy, working in cellars. And so that's what I did when I came back through the following harvest.
Yeah, so tell me about that. Tell me about you have a goal in mind, and you know it's going to take a little while to get there. So tell me about some of the stops along the way for you, places you worked, people you worked for. What were some of the kind of more memorable ones or more meaningful ones to you?
So I worked I spent some time working in the cellar with Jim Prosser at J.K. Carrier back when he was at the Hazelnut Shed, and Jim was a figure for me. Winemakers always have like wines that they're like ghosts that haunt their memories. And I remember tasting Jim's out of barrel, what eventually went on to become his 2000 Isabel. And even to this day, I'm just sort of like, wow. As I think about it, I'm transported back to being in that room, tasting that wine and thinking like, holy shit, and then getting a couple bottles of that. And I think I drank the second one I had on my 50th birthday. And I said to myself, you should have waited to your 70th. That's how good it was, so working with Jim was good. He was, very iconoclastic, very obsessed with quality and the work, very thoughtful about what he did. He also taught me about, waste is the difference between you making it and you not making it. And so, every drop counts. Don't waste anything. He would describe it as the profits and the margins. And at that time, I didn't know accounting vocabulary. So for me, it was about when I thought of the margins, it was like making notes, on the page, the margin, and it was keeping everything, and that's been a good philosophy. So worked with him. Probably the most influential was my friend was the assistant. Well, he was a cellar master, then he became assistant winemaker at Chehalem when Harry had it, and so I would help them finish wines. So whether it was the summer of 2003, I helped them finish the 2003 vintage, or excuse me, it would have been the summer of 2004. I helped them finish the 2003 vintage. In 2005, I helped them finish both 2004 whites and 2004 reds. So I learned to finish wines at Chehalem, which I think was a really good place to do that. There was neck deep in winemaking talent. Harry, of course, very technically knowledged, but also very creative, made wines from the heart, but was very thoughtful, used outside, consulting to help improve their game. And then there was Michael Davies. He was there. Then Mike, who was the cellar master, he's now out of the business. He moved back to New Zealand. And there was just a lot of winemaking experience on that staff. So finishing wines with those guys, thinking things through. And again, they were another bursting at the seams facility. So, you learn how to do it in a state of perpetual discomfort, which is, I think, where you need to be in terms of space. And so it was a great place to learn to finish wines. I also did a little bit of work for Jay Summers when he had Jay Christopher back out in West Lynn. I was just trying to hustle up work anywhere I could with as many people as I could.
What were the biggest takeaways for you there as you were kind of developing your own winemaking philosophy and thinking about your future projects? What were the biggest, either big picture or small picture takeaways for you?
I think, it was at that point, up until I would say the spring of 2004, it was all sort of like still, I describe, your first harvest is, you're looking at your thing. Your second harvest, you just realize, wow, there's this whole winery going on around me. Your third harvest, you start to maybe, look and try to figure out what's going on beyond your thing. It wasn't until probably the fourth vintage, 2004 in Martinborough, where I was able to really sort of not fully understand it, but wrap my head around it. So I think up until that point, it was about, like physical mastery. It was the same philosophy I had in the kitchens. It was, like food is great and wine is great because somebody's really good at emptying a barrel. Not because the guy that told them to do it is brilliant. And so that's important. There needs to be like this idea, this vision for what we're doing, but we have to be really good at doing that, those minuscule things, topping, things like that. So the tedium and the meticulousness, especially Jim was incredibly meticulous, and they were meticulous at Chehalem as well, but it was like paying attention to these details. And so just appreciating the importance of the details and the number of details. And then at that point, I didn't have the skill to sort of triage details and sort of figure out which ones were the most important. It was like everything was important. And it took me a while in the winemaker role to start to pare that down.
So what was next for you after that?
So I spent that summer of 2003 working in cellars, and then 2003 harvest, I worked with Michael Stevenson at Panther Creek. And at that time it was, Michael and Jack and Ron owned it, and it was in the old, the facility there in McMinnville. And it was almost exclusively Pinot Noir, really great vineyards. And so that was where I got to start to see the picking decision. We were going out as a team, walking vineyards, tasting grapes, discussing things, and figuring out when we were going to pick. And then coming in and, just doing it. The 2003 vintage was one of those where it was go time everywhere for everybody. And so that was a grind, and being in that and knowing that you could get through that. What I really learned in 2003 is eventually it ends. But again, it was a really challenging vintage, and it was the first vintage where Oregon-wide we were faced with what I would later, discover was pretty common in California. That kind of vintage, dealing with grapes exposed to that kind of heat. It became very clear of how willing people were to respond to a vintage. If you were just going to be like, we're going to let the vintage speak for itself, like there was a lot of red grappa made that year, things that, I remember tasting Pinot Blancs that were 16% alcohol. And then there were people who responded to the vintage. Michael was willing to respond to the vintage, and we did. And so I think we did fairly well there in 2003. But that was a learning experience. One, seeing this new extreme, as opposed to like cold and wet, seeing hot. That was fairly new for the industry, and seeing, eventually sort of losing this, this idealism of, you just pick the grapes and whatever happens, happens. That's great. And great vintages from great vineyards, that happens. Not every vintage is great, and not every vineyard is great. And your job as a winemaker is to make it look like they were. And sometimes you have to make the wine. And so that was, what I learned in 2003.
What came next?
I think after that, I went back and did catering again. And I think it was after that, it just became clear to me that I needed to find a way to do wine full time. I just remember doing a catering event with somebody. We were in a house, and it was a private event. It was small, and I just remember like I was making a sauce, and I was mounting it with butter, and I remember hitting the spoon of the butter on the pan to knock it off into the sauce where I could mount it. And the chef was like, "I need you to stop doing that." And then I did it again, not even thinking. And just the look she gave me. And I just said after that dinner, I was like, this is my last one. I think I had a few more scheduled with her. I'm like, "I'm sorry, but you need somebody that wants to be here, and I don't want to be here anymore." So that was like that winter, and then I got to go to New Zealand again in the spring, our spring of 2004, and that was the most important vintage I think I worked for somebody else, was 2004.
Why is that?
So Clare Mulholland, I think is, most people would go, "Who's Clare Mulholland?" And I'd be like, well, that's one of the great injustices of the world, that when we talk about great winemakers, that she's not one of the first ones to be talked about. I describe my experience in New Zealand working with her in 2004 as clarification. All of her wines were great. Every wine she made was among the best examples of that wine in New Zealand. Her Sauvignon Blanc could have been up against any Sauvignon Blanc made in New Zealand. Her Pinot Noirs were arguably the best in New Zealand. Her Chardonnays, same. Her Rieslings were great. Everything she did was top notch. And she did it with this sort of faith in the process. And so there was, the incident that stands out in my mind is all of her ferments were spontaneous, and there wasn't a lot of like temperature control. So it wasn't like she was chilling things down, then warming them up. She had temperature control, but she was, she kind of let things happen on a timeline. And there was this one fermenter that was like mobbed by fruit flies, and so it's just, like you walk past and there's a cloud, and it was kind of an outlier. The rest of them weren't like that, but this one was really bad. And so I was like, are you going to inoculate that? And she was like, "No." And I'm like, "So you don't mind those fruit flies?" And she goes, "Oh, I mind them." But that was it. It was like this faith in the process. Like, yeah, I would prefer that we don't have the fruit flies, but we're not gonna intervene in the process. This isn't gonna ruin it, And so that whole process, and just having, just her feel about things. And it was interesting because she was actually pregnant at the time, and Martinborough Vineyard had just merged with another winery. And so the way she described it is she felt that if she told ownership that she was pregnant, they would force a consultant on her. So she was like overseeing both operations. So she didn't tell anybody. So none of us knew. And then when she did tell us, it was like, oh, it was obvious. It was like she would only have a taste when we would have drinks afterwards. She was always asking for people's input, like calibrating her palate, which I think was also very important, to sort of understand that, outside opinions are useful. But she just had this, this kind of, this faith in the process that was just amazing. And then, sort of very clear, she had it down. There were the things she knew that needed to be done. Like you got to clean. We're not, like there's no such thing as sterile. We're not doing brain surgery in here. Like we have to clean things, but let's spend our time doing the things that are important. So there's just this focus on the right things with Claire was just amazing. And she was awesome. She was just very sharing, and she gave me some advice. I asked her as I was leaving, the last couple of days there, I said, this is what I want to do. What advice do you have for me? And she said, when you get the chance to do it, take it. Like let somebody else decide when you're ready to be a winemaker. Don't put that limit on yourself. And I think that's good advice. Yeah. So it was a great experience. Clarification. I found clarification.
I love that.
Yeah.
So at this point, you're bouncing back and forth, New Zealand, Oregon a lot. Is Oregon still the place you want to be? Are you thinking New Zealand as a future?
I didn't. For me, you know, everybody I ever talked to that worked in New Zealand was like, oh, I just wanted to stay there. For me, I just kind of felt like it was the last stop before Antarctica. There was just a sense of isolation that I felt about New Zealand that made me not want to live there. You know, I did want to go back and do another harvest there. I was trying to set up another one for 2005, but it didn't work out. But I never wanted to live there. And it was interesting. The thing with me with Oregon was, you know, I was probably here. I moved here in 2000. I was probably here a week. And I realized, like, no, I don't think I ever want to live somewhere else. Now, as we get further in the story, we'll see that I did move, but I came back. Yeah.
Well, continue then. What happened after New Zealand?
So I came back and I spent the summer stringing together, you know, cellar work and cab driving. And so in Portland, I liked cab driving. One, it was cash money. I could work or not work. They didn't care. I didn't have to give them notice. You know, they could care less if I showed up to rent a cab for the day. So it was interesting, and it was off hours, so I could work for somebody in the cellar and then go work nights. I mean, there was one time at Chehalem where I got off, they were bottling, and the winemaker wasn't going to be there, so he needed somebody to come in early to open up and be ready to go. So I turned my cab in at 5, drove to Chehalem, and worked until, you know, basically 5 that day. So I did a 24-hour shift, getting in early and doing that, and made for a good story. It's not something I want to do forever, but I could do that. I could make money and work in the cellars, and you know, it was something that I could do when I wanted. And then I wanted to do an international harvest, so I started reaching out to Germany. I, you know, emailed 3 producers in Germany. I emailed 2 producers in France and 1 producer in Italy. Never heard back from the Italian. The Alsace, I sent an email to Marcel Dees. He responded in, I think, March of 2005, saying that he didn't have a position available for 2004. And Christophe Roumier hung up on me when he saw I didn't speak French. The Germans, all 3 responded in 24 hours. Schloss Lieser said, we don't speak English, so no. Ernie Lawson said, yes, but we won't pay you. And Johanna Selbach said, yes, we might pay you. And so I said, might get paid. So in 2004, I had harvest lined up to go to Germany. And Michael from Panther Creek called up and said, hey, you know, we're looking for some harvest help. And I was like, well, I'm headed to Germany. And he was like, well, when do you start there? And so I told him the date. He was like, you know, we'll probably be early. So if you want, you can work for us until then. So I said, okay. So 2004 vintage, I worked for Panther Creek again, finished there on a Friday, hopped on a plane on Sunday, went to Germany and did another. So 2004 were 3 vintages. At one point I had the aspiration of doing 4 vintages in a year. And then, you know, after doing 3, I was just like, you know, doing 4, I'm just going to be dumber than myself. This isn't, you know, like, so I don't need to do 4. I already own the title for dumb winemaking, so that was it. So I decided not to do anymore. And then it turned out that I was able to sort of move into, you know, full-time positions after that. But yeah, so Panther Creek 2004, another interesting vintage. You know, it was really uneven yields. Like this vine had too much fruit, that vine had hardly any fruit. And so we were dealing with this overripe, underripe sort of characters. And again, Michael, you know, being a winemaker that's willing to respond. What was interesting about 2004 is that it was looking like 2003, then the rain came. And it was amazing watching how not only did sugars change, but acids changed too. So it was like almost like there was this pent up energy in the vine that was liberated by the rain. But that was, it was a good experience, 2004. And then, going to Germany, and Germany was the other like really formative experience for me.
Tell me about that.
So, the old world, I wanted an old world harvest, and I think I wanted one because I just wanted one. One, I wanted a Riesling harvest because in 2003 in New Zealand, I went there and like, I want to make great Pinot Noir. And then the winemaker invited me to go out with him to a friend's house for the weekend on a venison ranch. And we get there, and right before dinner, the host pushes a chair out of the way and opens a trap door and goes in underneath the house and comes out with these 2 bottles that were like moldy labels, Hock bottles, and he closes it. Well, he used to be a German wine importer. And he pulled out 2 Rieslings from 1971 and 1976. And so by the end of that meal, my objective had changed from being a great Pinot Noir winemaker to being a great Pinot Noir and a Riesling maker. And so I wanted a Riesling vintage. Really, a white wine vintage, but Riesling in particular. So that's almost exclusively what we did. I think we had 2 fermentations in Germany that weren't Riesling. So the old world was, at night I would go walk around town, which is surrounded by vineyards. So one of the things that really hit me in Germany was that here, harvest, if I go to the grocery store and I ask the random person, like, when's harvest happen, the wine harvest, most of them would have no idea. 25%. In Germany, everybody would know. In those wine villages, people's the rail is a tendril. The women's jewelry are clusters and vines, and so there is no separation between the culture and the wine culture. And so for me, I think that's a tremendous competitive advantage the old world has, is that they have these cultures that are built around the grape. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I came back was kind of try to promote that. And so, that sort of fascination. And the other thing that I learned, it's like you get the sense of history. So I'm walking around vineyards that, like the Romans first planted. And seeing high water marks on buildings going back to 1190, and then I read, I think I was there or shortly after I left, I read Wine and War, and you learn, here we had a little banking meltdown, like we didn't have a world war interrupting what we do, or not even interrupting, just complicating what we do. And so, that sort of the history, but there was something Johannes told me that, we were talking about things and he was like, you can ask about anything we do. And he said, the currency we trade is this: my grandfather didn't lie to my father didn't lie to me, and I won't lie to you. And it was very much like that. It was anything I wanted to know about. He would give me the reasons they do it. He would give me the reasons why his neighbor might not, which was very important. And then, he was, at one point, he worked in New York City in the office of the German wine promotion office. I don't know the exact name of it, but he not only was he a Mosler, he was pro-Germany. So every night we would probably open 6 or 8 bottles, which you can do. You can do that in work when it's 9% alcohol. But it was all over Germany. So I was tasting other varietals, but I was also tasting Rieslings from the Rheingau, the Pfalz, the Nah, and so learning this and him explaining to me why they're different, both in taste profile from the Mosel wines, but also why their geology is different, their geography is different, and all of that. And that was a fantastic experience. But what I really learned is, so in New Zealand, white winemaking is like complete phobia about oxygen. Like like don't even breathe on the press pan, like God forbid any oxygen get into that. So I get to Germany and we're just pumping air into it. We're turning everything brown. So I was like, how could this be? And so, what occurred to me was like, we're starting with different raw materials and we have different endpoints. And the winemaker's job is to build the bridge between what we have and what we want. And so in New Zealand, we're dealing with Sauvignon Blanc, very vegetal. If you oxidize that, you end up with canned peas and asparagus. I never like canned peas, but I like asparagus, but I don't want my wine to smell like it. And in Germany, we're dealing with, high acid, searing acidity Rieslings that, that if they have tannin, they become very hard and bitter. So this oxidation was about, partially about managing the phenols. And so it was a real mind shift for me. Wasn't that like, we're not bringing techniques. And I feel like what I saw in Oregon, there was a lot of winemaking. I call it soundbite winemaking, which was so-and-so does this, like for instance, people would spontaneously, I do native ferments, and we can get into my thoughts on that at some point, but we do native ferments, and well, why? Well, Steve Warner does that. Well, do you know what Steve does before? Do you know what Steve does after? So there's a soundbite, and so I worked for people like this that were, a collection of sound bites that, well, Beau Frere did this, but it's like, and you put all that together, it's like, like maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but for me, it was like being very deliberate about what I do now influences what I do next. What I would like to do next is influenced by what I do now, so that the wine is a collection of all these steps, and being very thoughtful about these steps. And so I think that thoughtfulness has really sort of defined how I approach wine, being very deliberate about, one, the outcome, and having a sense of where we want this to go, and then looking at what we have, and then building the protocols to do that. And that, for me, I treat Chardonnay different than Pinot Blanc, different than Riesling, because of different desired outcomes with different starting points. And so that was a real take home from Germany there. And then, after doing 3 harvests in a year, I was questioning, like, I know, is this really what I want to do? Like it was pretty exhausting. And then I think I did a little bit of cab driving again, and some helping Chehalem out, some cellar work. And then I landed the gig at Patten Valley, and that was the travel was over at that point.
So tell me about finding the first full-time job, and about how that sort of changes your approach.
So I interviewed for several jobs, and I interviewed for some assistant winemaker jobs, and technically I was hired on as assistant winemaker at Patten Valley, and it was basically deciding, like, I don't want to drive cab. I don't want to do these other things. I want to be in wine. This is what I want to do. Let's find a place where this is it. And so, I had some interviews. There are a few positions I didn't get, both assistant winemaker and winemaking positions. And, the Patten Valley job came up, and I forget how I found out about it, but I went and I interviewed for it, and I got it. And what I liked about it was an opportunity to manage the vineyard and make the wine. And so that was what I realized in Germany, was that, the name vineyard is Weingarten, wine garden. There's not this mental separation between vineyard and wine in the old world like there is here. And so, and what I think I realized by that point, or shortly after that, was that, the space between the vineyard manager or, the vineyard, whether it's just the manager or ownership, and winemaking and winery, that gap is where quality is lost. And so at Patten Valley, there was no gap. It was us, and specifically me and my guy Chewy that drove the tractor, and his family that did the work. And so that was really appealing about that job. But also like I wanted a little more money, and so they were like, okay, you could do Oregon wholesale. So I was carrying a bag in Portland, all this unknowns to me, preparing me to do all this stuff on my own. But it was, again, like I worked, I just like, it didn't feel like work. Like what? I get to make wine. I get to walk vineyards. I get to go out and pour wine for people, like, yeah, no, I'll do this 15 hours a day. Yeah, no problem. And so, landing that Patton Valley gig, it was great. It was the next level, and it was an inflection point.
So when you're tied to a place like that and you're there beyond harvest, what's different? What did you have to learn?
I had to. I was responsible for a lot more. So there was a lot more stuff going on. There was, there wasn't like this sucks, well, I'll be out of here in, 3 weeks kind of thing. And I still think Monty Pitt is the best boss I ever had. The boss I have now is a total jerk, but he was the best boss I ever had. And he gave me a lot of freedom, and so I couldn't really complain too much about that. But a lot of it was being responsible for the entire thing, like your years planned out, and then just like the logistics of people, the logistics of materials, managing a facility. All of those things were things I hadn't done before. Interacting, and for the first time, like. It was this whole front of the house thing. We didn't have a tasting room at the time, but it was like this sales aspect, which is the wine business. Making wine is not a business. Selling wine is a business. And so marketing, seeing those things and having to interact and interface and play a role in that. And I think I learned that I had somewhat of an aptitude for that, but that how important that was. So that was very important. And also, the finance aspect of it, I remember sitting through a presentation with the guys from Silicon Valley Bank, and just being like, wow, this is really stupid business, like, and so, all of that, being exposed to all of that on a fairly small scale with limited responsibility. I was never like given a budget. It was just kind of like, don't spend money. That was the budget. And I was happy to do that. I tend to be frugal by nature. I'll spend my own money. I don't like spending other people's. But, also at the same time, it was 50% new oak. So we were willing to spend money on barrels. And so it was like this thing. And then paying attention to all those things. Thinking long-term about the vineyard, I think, was another thing. It was like, okay, we're not even just thinking about a vintage. Now we're thinking about vintages into the future. And so, making some changes in the farming, and just, that becoming something that I now had to learn about or got to learn about. So, now when I would go to the Oregon Wine Symposium, I didn't go to winemaking sessions. I went to viticultural sessions. And every opportunity I could, my reading, I started reading, Charboso's Healthy Crops. And so learning everything I could about soil, microbiology, took some classes at Chemeketa, took a soils class there, trying to, learn that, knowing that was the, if we wanted to make great wines, like that was the place to start. And so, and then learning about, vineyards from the guys, the Mora brothers, who did the farming at Patton Valley at the time. They now farm Bednarik, which is why I'm working with Bednarik fruit. And so those guys have, taught me so much about the practicalities. Because I remember I would go out in the vineyard after they would pass through, and I'd just be like, I'd be pissed off. Like, why did they not do, and then it's like, you didn't see what it looked like before. It's like you're armchair quarterbacking here. Like, do you think it would look better if you did it? Yeah, so, yeah. like let the pros do it. You don't call your plumber to ask about your neck pain, and so learning to like trust other people to do things was a big thing for me and continues to be realistically. But so yeah, the Patton Valley was a great experience, and I was there for 5 vintages.
So tell me about, I think with a lot of people you've spoken with, you find a passion for wine from harvest and the rush and the adrenaline, and then you see the rest of it, and it's less exciting. You mentioned kind of earlier you're babysitting rather than creating maybe or making. So tell me about being there full year. What did you find that was exciting outside of the adrenaline? What kept you motivated and excited?
One was, watching the wines grow up, because, doing harvests, like you come in, you put it in barrel, and maybe you get to go back and do some barrel tasting later. Surprisingly how little I did that, and surprisingly how little interns I've had have come back to want to follow the work. And I've always said, you're welcome to, and you get wine when it gets bottled. I've never had an intern come back to get it. I didn't, and I never went back and got, the wines that I had made. And so, watching them evolve was really appealing. The sales process, understanding how important that was and what that looked like. And I felt like, in hindsight, it was kind of exciting at first. At some point, it not being an extrovert and also having these other things to do, the sales became less of something that I was excited about, but I knew it was important, and so it was still something I took very seriously. And also, I was incentivized to sell, which that was something to learn as well. Money had never really previously been a motivation for me. I always. Everybody needs money, but it wasn't like I'd never looked for the job that paid more. But, I can, if I sell more wine, I make more money, let's go do it. And at that point, they were my wines, and so I wanted them out there. I wanted to put that in the world, and so I think that selling other people's wines, which is something I've had to do every time I've taken a new position, that's drudgery. Even if they're good wines, you don't want to. It's like it's really hard to go out there and either talk about somebody else's wines or pretend ownership of them. But once they're yours, I wanted to put them into the world. I wanted to go out and do that. I wanted to go pour them side by side with other wineries. It became sort of like a competitive thing, and not the sense that any of us win, but I wanted to see the look on someone's face after they when they tasted my wine, after they had tasted, some. The who's who, and those feedback loops were interesting. And I wasn't so much interested in what people said about the wines. I was interested in their reaction, their, especially the eyebrow test. It's like, okay, there, we're onto something, or maybe it's not for them. But learning how to talk about wines, and that not everybody wants to hear the same story, and that was very valuable. But also learning how to set up an open house, and in hindsight we didn't use the word iteration or innovation, but every time we did something, it was like, what didn't work? So the next time we do it, we would do it a little bit differently, trying to, to make things better for guests, and also, to sell wine, because again, at the end of the day, I would love to just make it, but, it turns out I can only drink so much. We got to sell it. And so, finding those things to be exciting, it wasn't adrenaline. It was a different interest and a different curiosity, and it was almost, it's kind of like growing up and becoming an adult member of the wine business, as opposed to some, brash kid that always just wants to do what he wants to do. And I was in my 30s, but I'm a late starter. Yeah.
What's after Patton Valley?
So after Patton Valley, I decided to leave Patton Valley, and I thought, maybe I'll get into consulting. And then I got contacted by a headhunter who was hiring for the what turned out to be the Van Duzer position. So Van Duzer at that point had been underperforming for several years. And one of the things that I realized is that, there's your skill set, right? There's what you can do, and then there's limitations in the environment, either meddling of ownership, or we just don't have the money to do that, or for instance, Patton Valley, we didn't filter, we didn't add yeast, so it was like, okay, and at the time I was very much fine with both of those things, but if I would have thought that the wines, given a vintage or something, that it would have been better if we added yeast, it wasn't an option. So there was always this, sort of the limitation, and we could always, to some extent, say that the wines weren't a complete reflection of your abilities. And so when I left Patton Valley, it was about looking for opportunities where those constraints were there. There was more room, so that the goal was to find out how good I am not. To find me in a position where if the wines aren't exceptional, it's my fault. And so Van Duzer was the next step in that. It was much better funded. It was a bigger winery, and there were layers. And so at this point, I'm starting to, I'd gotten married and talking about starting a family. So we wanted layers, so that to do that. And so I wanted to move to a bigger operation. And Van Duzer was that operation, and they were looking to make some changes. They weren't looking to maintain a status quo, which was important to me, not only because I'm not really good at status quo, but their status quo, they weren't happy with it, and so I certainly wasn't going to put myself in a situation to maintain that. And so got to get in there and get started with them, and it was sort of like, I remember describing it. We didn't have a 3-year plan. We had a right fucking now plan, and we were going to make dramatically better wines in year one, and we had the ownership had the support for the equipment to do things. I remember at one point I was like, I don't know, that seems really expensive. He was like, it's my money. I'll spend it if I want. And I'm like, all right. Again, being this frugal, like don't spend money thing to, the honeymoon phase eventually wears off, but he was willing to take a relatively new winery and completely retool it. And so that winery was built to be a bigger winery than it was. I think it was built to handle grapes other than Pinot Noir, despite the fact it didn't. It was not built like an Oregon winery. It was not built like a high-end Pinot Noir winery. And by the time I left, it was. And so, that it wasn't anything I did. He was willing to do what needed to be done. And I remember even having a conversation with Harvey Steinman, the Oregon reviewer at the Spectator at that time. Harvey just wouldn't even taste the Van Duzer wines up to that point. And so I invited him to come visit. I knew he was coming out to the Oregon Wine Symposium. And I said, I'd love to get your feedback. Would you come by and taste the wines? And he was like, what are you doing different? And I was like, I'd love to tell you that we've got this fancy, best high-end equipment, that we're doing all this stuff. And I said, really, Harvey, we're just doing the things that we know work really well now. And that was it, and we were able to make those changes in year one because Carl was willing to do that.
What year did you start at Van Duzer?
That would have been 2010. So 2010, cool vintage. And we had a consultant at the time, and he was saying, go down to 1 cluster per shoot. I recommend you go to 1 cluster per shoot. First of all, he had really, probably good advice, but it wasn't advice I was taking to my boss. He's like, oh, you just need to buy another vineyard. It's like, I've been here 3 weeks, man. That's not going to be the solution I provide to my boss. Like, we just need to buy a new vineyard. But he was like, let's go to 1 cluster per shoot. And I was like, we've done the estimates. Like, that'll be too low. And And thank God we didn't, because things still came in at like 1.5 tons to the acre, and we made the 2010s were really nice wines, but it was sort of learning, like being stuck in the middle of something, and it wasn't. Fortunately, it was an advising. It wasn't like I was there to execute the consultant's plans. It was he was there to advise me, and that was very helpful. But sometimes knowing, what and then owning, the outcome. 2011 was another vintage where I wish I would have dropped more fruit, but yields were so low in 2010 that made me nervous. But just sort of figuring that out. But 2010 was that first vintage there.
You talked about the winery not being set up in the way you thought it should, and you getting it changed. Give me an example. What was it missing, or what did it have that it shouldn't have had?
So it was must pumping, so it was rather, I think, coarse handling of a soft skinned grape, and it was large fermentations, so we wanted to scale down fermentation size. It was exclusively pump overs. We wanted to start to punch things down. We wanted to mix the cap up a little bit. Probably the most interesting example is we had a 16-ton press, and I remember asking, like, why do we have a 16-ton press? And the previous winemaker told me, well, because that's about how much we get a Pinot Gris. So they bought the press so they could do all the Pinot Gris in one press load. And then what they would do is, with the reds, they would wait till they had enough to press. And so it wasn't like I'm pressing this at the time that it needs to be pressed. I'm pressing this, when we can, fill up a press load. Yeah, so I actually sold that press to A to Z. That should tell you what a ridiculously massive press that was. They brought it in. It was a great press. It was just 10 times bigger than we needed. But that sort of mentality. And then we were also seeing that viticulturally as well. It was sort of like whatever crop it threw, is what it brought in. And in fact, we were working with Daniel Fay was consulting with us, now of RP. Well, he was with RP at the time, but he. As we're walking through the vineyard, he was like, yeah, you guys, there's no crop control. He could tell by looking at the physical architecture of the vine that there'd been no crop control, that we were, yo-yoing. And he was like, you might want to think about it. I'm like, we definitely want to think about that. And so, getting a handle on that, we had Rebecca Sweet was the vineyard manager when I came on. She was making the move to organics. They had since moved out of organics, but she was making the move to organics. And so, we were doing the things in the vineyard as well. One of the things we had to figure out was, not everything in the vineyard is a vineyard decision. Some of it's a winemaking decision. So we had to really sort of develop, define where my influence ended and hers began. So for me, I don't micromanage soil management or pest control. I think that's if a winemaker needs to do that, there's a problem with their vineyard manager. She knew that better than I did. And for me, there's an accountability issue. It's like, okay, so if you miss 5 sprays, but I told you about the spray program and we get a bunch of rot, like, who's to blame here? So you completely own that. Give me clean fruit, whatever you got to do. And she did. But there were a couple, there were aspects of vineyard management that influenced the outcome. And so we defined those as timing and degree of leaf pulling and yields. So I got to say when those things would happen. And it took us a while to sort of learn to do that, or to learn that I was serious about that. And Daniel helped a lot with that as well. But, and that carried over into some of my future activities. Was the one thing I learned is that, for Project M, I want to be 95% aligned at the handshake or signing. Like, give me a great vineyard, but you do this, or you don't do this or that. Like, I'm not interested, because one, I don't like being a squeaky wheel. I don't have time to be a squeaky wheel. More importantly, you don't want me to be a squeaky wheel. Like, I'm a really loud, I'm a very bad squeaky wheel. And so, everybody's happier when we're mostly aligned. But the basis of that was going from essentially complete control at Patton Valley to now having somebody, and then, working out like, okay, let's really think about what these responsibilities are. Let's think about the accountability for that. Let's think about expertise, and let's develop very clear criteria so that I can get what I want, and you can do what you're best at, and we can make this work. And so that was a great experience. It was really the first time I had to manage people, and not something I was good at then, probably. It's like I see the importance, but it's a skill I continue to develop.
You mentioned not having a long plan there, having it to do it right now. Tell me about the first year and about the first vintage.
So the first vintage, I felt like we had the winery tooled the way we needed, and the vineyard was cropped appropriately, if not even maybe a little bit light. I think part of it is, like the way I think about yields is I call it the 3 S's. There's site, season, and style. And so the site at Van Duzer, because it's cool, isn't necessarily a high yielding site, or it can yield a lot, but it may not deliver quality at that. And so starting to think about all that. So one of the things we started to do is we started to move away from thinking about tons per acre, because I had stuff at 10 feet spacing, 8 feet spacing. I had all this crazy stuff. And so it was like, let's move away from trying to make these apples to oranges comparisons. So we started to look at fruit per linear foot. So it was this idea of, which is a proxy for fruit per unit leaf surface area, and so, which is really what quality is about. And so we started to think more about that and look at that. And that's not something we saw in 2010, but it was something we applied to later thinking. But started to think about that, but it was really about, and then, basically, getting fruit picked at the right time. And I think that was probably one of the biggest advances we made was like, no, we're not going to pick the entire vineyard in 2 days unless that's what needs to happen. So, some picks were quite small, some picks were quite large. And it was about picking things at the right time. I had engaged with, there was a wine blogger that had come out, and I met with him and talked to him, and it turns out that wasn't his full-time job. He was a meteorologist, and I was like, oh, you work for, what do you do? He's like, I forecast weather for climbers on Everest. And it went off in my head, like life or death weather forecasting. I said, would you do this for me? And so we paid him some cash and some wine, and he would tap into all the weather stations around us. And then in the weeks leading up to harvest, he would start to say, hey, is it raining there? And I'd be like, no. And so he was looking at the macro and then figuring out what the micro looked at. So by the time harvest came, it would be like, hey, I want to pick on Friday. Forecast is calling for rain at noon. I want to pull, a bunch of fruit off. What do you think? He's like, it's not going to rain till 2. So okay, all right. So boom, we're going big. Bringing the fruit in. 1:45 comes in, starts to drizzle. It was really great. So that sort of attention to detail. But it was really about, at some point we're looking at optical sorting to get rid of rot. And I was like, look, let's get the 95% dialed in right, and we can do that. So it was really about being clean, because the winery had some microbial issues. It was about being clean. It was about picking at the right time, and then really monitoring fermentations and doing the right things at the right time. So, like if we got to be here late, it's not an 8 to 5 job. And there was some pressures previously to sort of do that, to fit harvest into a regular job. And I just said, well, that's not going to happen. You know, we're going to do things when they need to be done. And that might be long days, that might be long weeks, but that's what we're going to do. And we did it. And we saw, you know, pretty dramatic results fairly early.
So take me through your time at Van Duzer. What were the achievements? What were the highlights?
So, you know, 2010. So again, I talked about, you know, inviting Harvey out, and you know, in that interaction, Harvey was like, "I don't even taste the wine. You send me samples, I don't taste them." We went from that to 92 points. And at that time, 92 points was really good. It's not like now where it seems like people are scoring a lot higher. 92 was like a really good score. To do that in one vintage was really great. And to sort of get the winery tool down, and then to start getting people excited about that. 2011. Just a tough vintage for everybody. I feel like it was particularly tough it was an interesting thing about the Van Duzer corridor. We usually think about it being a cooling effect, but it's actually a moderating effect. You know, marine temperatures are much more stable than terrestrial temperatures. So typically, we think about the Van Duzer effect is that the valley's warmer, the ocean's cooler, it brings cool air in. 2011, the valley was very cool, and so the Van Duzer effect had a slightly warming effect. Not warming enough, but it was a wind effect, so that as I would drive out to the winery from McMinnville, there'd be cloud cover everywhere, but there was like this blue sky over Van Duzer. And you know, I think it was tough. You know, I think we finished picking in November, but you know, I think if I could go back to that vintage, I would have pushed a drop fruit. It was just after that previous vintage. You know, and like the lesson learned there is, you know, if the wines aren't great, any amount's too much. And so, you know, like where do you want to feel the pain? Do you want to feel it at the vineyard? And you know, this became a thing with my advising and consulting as well. Like, you know, like stop the pain at the vineyard. Either drop the fruit or don't pick it. And you know, in some cases and things like that. But you know, 2011 was a bit of a challenge in that regard. And so, you know, we did the best we could. You know, those wines were, you know, a detraction. Then 2012, we were back up. But for, you know, the breakthroughs there were, you know, we started to get some recognition. People started to talk about the brand. And, you know, we started to see it a bit in the market as well. So the white wines, you know, like the Pinot Gris, the 2010 Pinot Gris might be, you know, the top 5 white wines I've ever made. You know, so, and that was the first opportunity I had to make white wines. And so we started making Riesling in 2011, probably not the best vintage to make Riesling. But, and so, yeah, you know, we got to expand. I got to do more of what I did. I got to start to see vineyard development. So they were, you know, they had Syrah planted. And so I'm like, this doesn't make sense. So we pulled that out and replanted some interesting clonal material of Pinot Noir. And so, you know, trying to think about big picture, and you know, and Carl's a big picture thinker. I mean, he's a VC. You know, I've been fortunate that a couple people I've worked with or worked for in the wine business have, you know, it would be hard to imagine a room where they're not the smartest guy, and Carl was one of those, and the other one would be Dave Chen at Patton Valley. You know, like just like brain power and perspective and big thinking, and those were great opportunities to be around. You know, I remember Carl. You know, we had a lot that some Brett crept up, and I said it's there, and he said, well, how many barrels out of the lot? And I was like, well, I don't know, I didn't test every barrel. And he's like, well, why not? I said, well, you know, it's going to be $150 a barrel. He was like, okay. So you test that barrel. If the barrel has Brett, it's a $25 wine. If it doesn't, it's a $50 wine. For $125, you can make that? Like, why are we having this conversation? You know, and it's like, oh, okay. You know, like that sort of thinking never occurred to me because it was always about like, well, just don't spend that money, don't spend that money. But it's like, start to think about return on an investment and opportunity cost and things like that. So working with Carl and that way was great. Yeah.
Next step after Van Duzer?
So my my now ex-wife, she was always looking for other opportunities for me, particularly ones that might pay more. And so she sends me this thing that says, some winery in the Anderson Valley in California is looking for a winemaker. And so, at this point, the fit for me and Van Duzer wasn't working out so well. So I think I sent a resume in and immediately get a call back. And it turns out it's Champagne Louis Roeder Estate, Scharfenberger. They're wanting to launch a still wine project. They had acquired a property that had a winery on it. And so, it was sort of this turnkey, and they had a vintage and barrel of still wines, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and they were looking for a winemaker. And so, hop on a call, and so I have a call with them, and I'm thinking, this is Champagne Louis Roeder, this is California, there's thousands of people that are more qualified than I am. So I had the conversation, was like, hey, thanks for your time, appreciate it. Figured that was that. Next call, can you come down and interview? So I'm like, sure. So I fly into Oakland. I meet with the CEO of Maison Marque and Domaine, so Champagne Louis Roeder. They have a marketing arm that handles all the management of the domestic operations. And I meet with the CEO there. I meet with the VP of winemaking in Oakland, and great conversation. I think I'm there overnight, and then I hop on a plane and I fly. I'm like, oh, that was interesting. And then, I land and I get a message, when can you come down and visit the winery, come out to the Anderson Valley? And I was like, okay, all right, so I could do this. And so, end up in the Anderson Valley, and I'm looking around, and, I see the opportunity. And just about that time, Anderson Valley is on the cover of the Wine Spectator. So this is a region that's now getting some attention. And and the magazine's sort of stake was this, a lot of great wines, but they lack an identity, And what I realized is because, it's like if you could condense the Willamette Valley into a 15-mile stretch that's 2 miles wide, that diversity in that small of an area, that's the Anderson Valley. And so what I realized was that the lack of identity was a lack of diversity in sourcing, that all these people that were defining the Anderson Valley were sourcing from one small part of it. We farmed 20% of the Anderson Valley, and we could go in and cherry pick these vineyards. And so when interviewed, that seemed to go well, and so I flew back and thought, well, that was a great experience. They're gonna find somebody closer by, and so then it was, do you want to come back to Oakland? We'd like it was like, we need to fly you to Paris so you can meet with ownership and the VP, and then it turned out they could do this through they had. Before it was really common, like a Zoom sort of advanced communication system. So I just flew back into Oakland, and I met with Jean-Baptiste Lecalion, the president, and chef de cave, or that's not even a fair assessment because he oversaw all the production of, I think at that time, Louis Roeder owned 7 properties worldwide. So he oversaw winemaking in all of those. And Frederic Rousseau, the owner, because Champagne Louis Roeder was family owned. So sat into an interview with them, and, they were like, can you leave the room? And then I come back in, and they offer me the job. And, it was just sort of like, as Jackson family, as the Californians were coming north, I decided to go south. And for me, it was really about, I consider myself a student of the grape, and I had developed these assumptions about growing and making Pinot Noir. And I realized a couple things, but one was that were the assumptions only applicable to the Willamette Valley, or were these more gross generalizations? And so to test that, I needed to go somewhere else. And then also back to that idea that, what's the limit? And so I thought, this is Champagne-Louis Roeder, like this will be the place that you will find out how good you are or are not. And so, I took the position and moved my wife and daughter down to the Anderson Valley.
What year?
That was 2013.
Tell me about the experience.
So the Anderson Valley was really remote. So it was an odd place to bring my family. And I think that increasingly weighed heavily on me. And then there were some health issues with my wife and daughter that were the result of, I think, where we lived, the house we lived in. And so that weighed heavily on me. But the other thing that I didn't think about until I was there and in it was that, the cultural implications of sparkling wine versus still wines, and Pinot Noir specifically. So, I think Roeder had been there since the early 80s. Scharfenberger, they had acquired Scharfenberger sometime in the early 2000s. So sparkling wine production, they made a little bit of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir to sell in the tasting rooms, but there wasn't much. They weren't doing that. This operation was going to be still wine focused. And I remember, asking that my rows would be marked so that I could sample or I could walk the vineyard, and I got there in May and it was about June and I'm walking the vineyard and I'm having to call and be like, so the red rows are mine? And so what I noticed is that there wasn't any difference in the farming between the sparkling and the Pinot Noir. And so, and so it's like, for me, it was just like, okay, like did I make a mistake or is this something we can change? And so, I started to push to try to, realize because the other thing is when you make sparkling wine, you make white wines, harvest ends at picking. Once you're done picking, that's it, right? You go back to 8 to 5, whatever the case may be. Well, with red wine making, you don't, because you got 2 to 3 weeks later, you got this other big hump. And so, they were taking my equipment away, the trucks that I would dump pumice into. So there was this thing, I was like, hey, look, I need this. Being sort of low in agreeability, the way I say those things aren't appreciated by large French companies. And so what I found was that I found my limit. I wasn't able to influence them in a way, or at least on the timeline that I had for myself. And so, it was the other interesting thing is, they've been doing this for 200 years, they think in generations, so going back to like the Van Duzer, we didn't have a 3-year plan, we had a right now plan. There wasn't that sense of urgency. I mean, I remember the CEO saying to me, if we get these vineyards figured out in 30 years, I think that would be pretty good. And I'm thinking, well, I'm probably going to be retired in 30 years, or hopefully. And so, and it was this timeline. And so I wasn't able to influence the culture in a way or in a timeline. Maybe I didn't give myself enough time, but I wasn't able to make the impact at Domaine Anderson that I wanted to make. And so I decided that and I also realized, we all know that vines have specific soils and climates they thrive in. Turns out winemakers do too. And mine was not the Anderson Valley in California. I wanted a place where I didn't have to worry about wells going dry, and so there were just a lot of things. And I just wanted to go home. I wanted to come back here. And so we made it through the spring of 2016. It was almost 3 years exactly to the day from when I arrived to when I left. But I felt like I wasn't able to make the impact that I wanted to make in a way that was sustainable. It sort of took my leaving to sort of make the points that I wanted to make. And then, this guy that come in, he got a crew. So he got to direct, the priority for their viticulture and things like that. Things that I was pushing for that I wasn't able to get. But my goal is always to leave places better than they were. And I've always done that. And I did that at Domaine Anderson as well, just not as better as I would have liked to have. Yeah. But I also got to test some of those assumptions. And so because of that diversity, one, I got to really sort of get soil as equating to terroir. I also sort of resolved to not use the word terroir. Like, I just don't do it. I think it's a loaded word. Your definition of terroir is different than mine. And so we can't ever have the same conversation. So coming away from that, I just started to refer to place. And the idea is that the place influences the wine. I also think that people over-index on soil when they have that discussion. And what I learned, and what I think the Anderson Valley is a stunning example of, is that the soils aren't really what, if you look at that 15-mile stretch from the Boonville end to the deep end, the soils might be different, but what's really different there is proximity to the ocean. And so, like being able to get out of my head, this idea of that soil is what it's all about. The other thing I learned is, when I got there and I looked at my vineyards that were on the steep hillsides, the vineyards that I would have coveted here in Oregon, they weren't our best vineyards. The best vineyards we had there were vineyards that were slightly lower in elevation, but weren't steep, so they captured nighttime air. And so that got me thinking about, as we experience climate change, is the ideal vineyard going to change? Should we be looking at steep vineyards? And not only that, furthermore, it's like a great Pinot Noir vineyard may not be a great Chardonnay vineyard, may not be a great Riesling vineyard. And so developing this specificity and looking more at geography and not just sort of taking this thing out. But some of the assumptions that I had made, like one of the things that I had really sort of come to believe was that the grape is a reproductive organ. And, then I go back to like first principles, and my physiology thinking is like, I'm unaware of reproductive cycles that once started are influenced by environmental conditions. So, like a baby takes 9 months, whether it's on the equator or at the North Pole. It doesn't, how much light, any of that doesn't really matter. And so I started to think about that. And part of that was some experience at Steamboat with the 2007 vintage. Some people did some picking trials and really starting to think about this day on vine thing. And so I had come to really believe that this was a thing, and it was about, this day on vine, that there's a maturation cycle that is an influence. It's not to say that the chemistry of a grape isn't influenced by environmental conditions. It's to say that, the relative development of skin and seed is on a similar timeline, And so, but then I had to think, okay, that I believe that holds true in the Willamette Valley, but if we look at average bloom dates between California and Oregon, we have 40 more hours of daylight in a growing season of the same length here than we do in San Francisco. So it was like the Anderson Valley, so how's this hold up? And so there we had some really interesting opportunities to look very carefully at that. And we had a vineyard that was there at the estate. I think, in 2013, we picked it at 25 bricks, 103 days post-bloom. And we had another vineyard that was further to the deep end, and we picked it at 23 bricks, 130 days post-bloom. And so when we tasted those wines side by side, the comment was the one picked at 25 bricks was underripe, and the one that picked at what would have been ideal chemistries was overripe. And so, this idea that this time on vine, this gestation period, if you will, has an influence on yes, flavor, chemistry, acid, that stuff, but the energy of the vine as well. And so it verified that for me. And so last several vintages here in Oregon have got me rethinking that a little bit, like these early blooms. So really, if we think about days on vine, it's really probably a proxy for daylight hours, which is much harder to sort of work on. But I think for me, I think I'm an overthinker. And so I'm always looking for the underlying. So Project M is about like the stuff beneath the surface. And I think, an exploration of like these things in wine that aren't conjecture or commonplace, like getting the difference between definition and explication. Defining is this word means this. Explicating is the nuance of that. And so I'm not interested in winemaking that is defining. I'm interested in explication, going deeper into what the meaning of the process is, but also of wine in general.
Coming back to Oregon 2016, was Project M in your head at that point, or what was the next step?
It was. I wanted to, what I realized in California was that at some point that I wasn't particularly employable, that I wasn't a good employee. Like I had ideas, I was stubborn. It's not that I wasn't flexible, but if I believed in something, I wasn't going to let it go. I could go along, like, no, we're not going to do that. I think that's the wrong decision. I will do what you want to do. I'm okay with that. But if you want me to be silent, that's not going to work. I'm not quiet. I've got opinions. I will share opinions. We can duke them out. You want to get our opinions on the mat. I will argue to the end of the earth on something. And if I'm wrong, I will change my mind. I seek out opportunities to disprove what I believe. And so I knew at some point I had to do this. I had to be my own boss because I was not a good employee. It turns out I'm not a good boss either. But talked about Monty being the best boss I ever had. I now have the worst boss I've ever had. That's me. But it was about coming back. It was when are we going to come back? And so I put in for a few jobs I didn't really want, and then an opportunity came up. Le Cadeau was making wine in the Archer space, and they were looking for somebody to help Jim. So it would be a subordinate role, assistant winemaker, but I'd more or less see the day-to-day. And through that interview process, what they realized is that their budget wasn't terribly appealing to me, but that they could offer me space. And so I thought, I'm leaving money on the table by not making my own wine this year. And it turns out that was completely the wrong way to think about it. But and so I was able to start Project M at that time, making wine in that facility. That's how Project M actually came to be. It was initially going to be called Aaliyah. I had the elevator pitch. I had it down. I'd been working on it for several years. I went to check on the trademark, or we went to trademark it, and 30 days before, a subsidiary of Jose Cuervo had filed an intent to trademark Aaliyah. And so I was like, well, that sounds like I'm not doing that. And the lawyer was like, you might be able to win, because I don't think they were in wine, And so he was like, you might be able to win. I was like, so you'll take it on contingency? And he was like, oh, no. And I'm like, then you don't think, I need to know we're going to win before I go poking the bull of Jose Cuervo. So we just said, that's not going to be it. So then it was back to the drawing board of finding a name. And I had always had this idea of my consulting company being Project M. And then, wines that I work on are called Project M Productions, a Project M Production. So that was the name of the LLC. And we were paying somebody for something at some point, because we had already started doing some consulting work before we started making wine under the Project M brand. And somebody was like, well, why don't you just call it Project M? And I was like, all right, done deal. And so then we had to go back. And so, I'm not going to ask you to edit this out, but this is the truth. And, the marketing lie is that it's the Roman numeral for 1,000, and there's 1,000 decisions in every bottle. And I've got a whole story about, being asked during harvest, we need new cars, we need a, washer and dryer, and I can't decide on this. Don't you know there's 1,000 decisions in every bottle? And so, but that's really how Project M came to be. And then we had to make up an origin story that fit. Yeah.
The real
Marketing. Exactly. Yeah.
So you've had this idea for a long time. You've made a lot of wine. You've seen a lot of wine. You have an idea for what Project M is going to be. Tell me about getting it started and about starting to create a presence, a label, starting to create vineyard relationships, starting to create the wines you want to create. So
Project M was about having something to say, and one of the things that I had hit on, was that, and it was while I was in California, and I remember I was working with, I was really getting into biodynamics, and I was spending my weekends at the Rudolf Steiner College. And biodynamics is just one subset of anthroposophy, which was this thing that Rudolf Steiner, he gave 6,000 lectures in his life, 4,000, 6,000 lectures on everything from banking to agriculture. So he had this really diverse thing. And as I got into that community, I got into all these other things, but there was something about, there was a conversation that took place and it was really the interesting thing about a lot of this happened with biodynamics was that they weren't epiphanies. They were seeds that would, over the course of months or even years would come and would then blossom into ideas. And I think that's the way they view the world or how they view ideas. But, this idea that, delicious food is healthy food. Like a really great tasting apple is better for you than one that doesn't taste good, because all of these things that make it taste good are a function of life, of these living forces. And so at some point, it occurred to me beauty, this is that what nourishes us, especially us as humans, if we want to step away from just the completely material world where I need proteins and carbohydrates, what nourishes the human and our ability, cognition, which is what separates us arguably from other life forms, is this life forces, and I believe that's manifest in beauty. And so beauty is the expression of life forces. And so whether it's architecture or music or food or wine, things that are beautiful nourish us in a way that other things don't. So that became the objective. So Project M is, and I've gone on record as saying that Project M's in the beauty business. We're not making makeup, but we want to make beautiful things. Because we think that's what the world needs more of. There's plenty of ugly. There's or worse yet, because we might not all disagree on, we would agree on what's ugly would be difficult for us, but mediocre, we're all pretty much aligned on what that is. So that's probably worse than the ugly, It has no pull, right? And so we wanted to focus on beauty, and what does that look like? And so for me, I struck on the 4 virtues: purity, precision, elegance, and transparency. So those are the attributes we try to bring into wines that then become beautiful. And so I work with Pinot Noir because it's the red grape most capable of pure, precise, elegant, transparent wines. And I work with Riesling because it's the white grape that does that. Now I make other white wines as well, and I try to bring somewhere on the continuum with each of those variables to it, whether it's my Chardonnay or my Pinot Blanc. But so now I have something to say. I mentioned earlier that I didn't want to make wine, so I had something to say. Now I have something to say. And so that was Project M is going to happen. I have something to say. and Project M is going to say it. And the other thing that I hit on was the idea of people, place, and time. So if we think about wine as a collusion of three forces, the people who work on the wines or the vineyard, which is a place, and the wine expresses those things in a given time. And so I describe them as the formative forces. And I'm currently able to do this with my Pinot Noir production. I would like to do it with some other wines as well. I make wines for each of those. So if you look at the way we structure our Pinot Noir production, we have Personify, our largest production wine. It is intended to set the style. This is what Project M is about. So it's about my decisions and whether that's what barrel, what sites to pick with, when to pick, all of those things. Then I make a series of single vineyard wines, which are place. Then every year I wanted something that really sort of pushed things into art, because I think that's where, like craft can be beautiful. Art, the idea of the inner experience, the beauty elicits inner experiences. Art does that. That's the role of art versus craft. Craft is useful, art is inspiring. And so I wanted the wine for time, the idea of the zeitgeist. And so every year I call it the Caro series, different name, different label every year, and it's blended with a specific abstract idea. And this was something that was inspiring from working with Jean-Baptiste at Domaine Anderson. The Brut Nature, Louis Roeder's Brut Nature, was a collaboration with French designer Philippe Starck. So Philippe would have these archetypal ideas that he would then give to Jean-Baptiste, and Jean-Baptiste had to turn those into technical aspects to make a wine that met this designer's vision. And I was like, wow, like this is cool. And so that's the idea behind the Caros. That's what the Caros is supposed to be. Every year I'm taking an idea and I'm translating it into wine with varying degrees of success. I mean, the wine's always good, but the ability of someone to get the idea, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so that's sort of how Project M came to be. And we started with, going to people I knew. And so one of my, again, like being disagreeable and wanting, sort of to be aligned up front, I went to growers. I'm a grower first. So my philosophy is I would rather work with a B vineyard farmed by an A farmer than an A vineyard farmed by a B farmer. What gets me excited, gets me out of bed in the morning is minimizing the difference between what is and what could be. So for me, the Champagne Louis Roeder opportunity, this was a, limitless potential, virtually, right? But it was such a huge space between where we were and where we could be. And I wasn't going to be the one to get it there. And so I would rather be 99% of the potential, of lesser potential, than 50% of greater potential, especially with vineyards and wine. And so, fortunately, I don't have to work with any B vineyards. So just let's go on the record there. I don't work with B vineyards, but I start with a grower. So who farms the way I want things to be farmed? And then I'd say, what do you have? And so first thing, I went to the Mora brothers, and they said, oh, we just took over this vineyard, Bednarik Vineyard. Have you heard of it? And I was like, actually, I worked with that at Panther Creek. And what's great about that opportunity is that it was an older vineyard that nobody really knew about, and it had always sort of underperformed. And so it's a really exciting time for that vineyard. I also got into Filament Vineyard, which was a collaborative effort with Drew Voigt and now Ben Castile for the Terrence David project, and Matzinger Davies that are working with that. So that's a really cool project. I got in with that. And so again, this was about existing relationships, leveraging that. Harry, who was still at Chehalem at the time, sold me Riesling from Corral Creek. We actually delivered it on the tractor to Archer to press it. And we made a rosé, but you talked about starting the label. We ended up bulking the rosé out because we weren't gonna have a label done in time. And so the label turned out to be a very challenging project that we ended up being completely happy with, but it was contentious and it was drawn out and it was very difficult to get what we wanted.
I want to go back for a second to, is it the Keros project, the Keros part?
Keros, the Keros series.
Give me an example of a concept you've tried to match a wine to.
So the best example and the most successful one of the abstraction was the 2017. So 2017, our culture was polarized. You know, people that I'd known for a long time were calling me bad names. I was calling people that used to be friends bad names. Like, we were polarized. So I thought, you know, like, what struck on me was like polarity. And so I named it Polarity. And I went out and I found a font for the back label that had been used in actual scientific studies. And what they did is they took groups that were either left-leaning or right-leaning, and they gave them viewpoints that would be challenging for them. And when they read it with this font, they were more open to it. So I thought, well, that's cool. And so that was more of an afterthought. I was like, what font should I use? And then I found this font, this study, and so I thought that was cool. But I thought, you know, like, okay, so we've got this idea of polarity, and we could talk about the extremes. So I often, for that vintage, I thought of the pendulum, right? So the pendulum swings from one extreme to the next. And we're really clear on what the extremes are, right? This is this extreme, this is this extreme. But as a pendulum swings back and forth, it always passes through the middle. And what I was curious about is, are there things that happen between the extremes that don't exist in either of the extremes? And so that if we say that there are extremes, but there's a space in between them, and there's a middle that these things pass through, are there things that arise that don't exist in the extremes? And so I took what I thought was my two most extreme vineyards, and I blended them 50-50. And I said, let's see what happens. Then the pandemic hits, and I get to do these virtual tastings with people. And so the packages I would offer one of the packages, they got to taste those two single vineyard wines before they tasted the Polarity. And so when we tasted the Polarity, I would ask them, are there things that, you know, and people would be like, oh, I totally get the Momtazi in that, or I totally get the Chehalem Mountain in that. I'm like, yeah, but do you get anything that didn't exist in those? And they were like, oh, that's a completely, you know, there are things. And so the idea was that there are these things that arise between the extremes. And so that, like, stopping the pendulum isn't the solution. You know, being in the middle isn't the solution. The solution is recognizing that there are extremes and that there are things that arise between those extremes that are interesting and useful. And so that is probably the most successful example that I had.
That's really cool. Yeah. So you mentioned the label being a struggle. Tell me more about that.
So we wanted original art, and we had these archetypal ideas that we wanted to sort of put out there. And the first creative, you know, directive was it has to depict something moving. Yeah, so this is the label. It's textural. You can a little higher. And you know, we wanted to depict something moving. My idea is I don't want to make, you know, no lazy, lethargic wines. Like, I want wines that move, you know, wines that have a sense of agility. So we gave the artists. First, we went to our label designer and we gave her these ideas, and you know, she was coming back with stuff that wasn't really appealing, and she was getting frustrated. We were getting frustrated. Realized right away, we're asking a graphic designer to be an artist. All right, so the problem isn't her, the problem is us. So went to several artists, gave them these archetypal ideas. They gave us exactly what we asked for, and we didn't like it. So again, you know, like, the problem isn't them, the problem is us. And, you know, at some point, it's like, at this time, my ex-wife and I had desks. We weren't exes at the time, but we had desks that faced each other, which is in hindsight, was just such a bad idea. Talk about setting up the conflict. It was like architectural, and so, but it was, we weren't getting anywhere. It was becoming very frustrating, and then I think we were both at the desk. It was like midnight one night, and so she turns her computer around. She's like, "What do you think of this?" And it was some work by this artist out of Mexico City. So we reach out to her. And she's like, yeah, like I'll give you 5 concepts. So we went from this, maybe we could use that, to, oh my God, we're like, which one of these are we going to use? And so we started to talk to her more about it, and she had taken the creative directives so well. And so she called this was the Sand series, and our Personify bottle, if you check out the Personify, the image that's on the Personify bottle was the original image from the Sand series. And so as soon as I saw it, I was like, that's the label. But knowing what I know, I can't just say that, right? So I just put it up on the cork board for a few days, and I just like, I don't know. And then, a couple days later, Meg is like, I think that should be the label. And I was like, this one? Are you sure? Oh, all right. So that became the label. And then we went back to her and said, give us 9 more. And so what it is she uses a process called process, or processing. I'm not sure which one of the two, which always makes the explanation sound like made up, because she uses a process called process. But she sets up a mathematical equation that's probabilities and limits, and then that is randomly populated with the dots. And so what we liked about that was I described the winemaking in the parentheses. And so the wine has to be Project M. If I'm going to put a Project M label on it, it has to meet certain criteria. Those are the parentheses. But within that, it can be whatever it wants. I'm not trying to exert a tremendous amount of control. I just need it to meet the things that say, this is Project M. And so I liked that aspect. We shared that with her. And so there's this sense of random to it. And I try to make room for random, the assumption that my intentions aren't always going to be the best outcomes, that there's room that fate or chance, goes back to Aaliyah, plays a role in this as well. And then the other thing we wanted is we don't want them to be depictions of anything. And so the idea of the internal yardstick. And so we never describe our wines as Burgundian or Alsatian or Germanic. That is by nature to basically limit us, that that's, we end where they begin. That's nonsense. And Burgundy is a place, and you can give me all the genetics you want. I can't make Burgundy, so why do we try? But we want internal yardsticks, I think. And the other aspect of that is, the whole time I worked for Champagne Louis Roeder, one of the greatest wine companies on earth, when you look at all their properties, excellence is just assumed. That is the expectation. The number of times we discussed scores in meetings were absolutely 0. It never came up. The yardstick was internal. Our definition of greatness is defined by us. Our job is to meet our definition of greatness. And if the world likes that, they'll give it 98 points. If they don't, they'll give it whatever they're going to give it. And we'll turn around and we'll do that again next year, because this is the yardstick for greatness. And so we wanted things that didn't depict anything else, because we're not imitating or impersonating anything or anywhere. And then the other thing I really liked about it is that it's just black and white, but it's made complex through structure. So my approach to winemaking is to build structures that are interesting, textures and energies. The way a wine feels in the mouth is what separates good wines from great wines. I mean, if you look at tasting notes for Pinot Noir, they all taste like cherries and smell like spice. The great ones feel different than those that aren't great. So that's the label. And then we had local label designer develop, the color scheme and to put all this into something. And it took us probably close to a year to get to that point. Took a long time. And we haven't made any changes since, which I think is pretty unusual. Most people are changing their labels. The Keros label, obviously. So the Keros is always an image on the front, usually original art that is public domain, because it's just easier for me to go out and find that. I am exploring, modern artists or even having people make art for it. And then, all the single vineyards have GPS coordinates, so people can go and see where it is on a map. But yeah, no, it took a long time, and we haven't made any changes, and we love the labels, and they're also textured. The idea is draw people in. If we can get people to want to put it in their hand and touch it, then we're halfway to the purchase. That was Meg, the marketing genius's input.
It's halfway in the cart at that point.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't work on mine so well, but yeah.
So talk a little bit about the growth of Project M, the brand, what you've done so far, and maybe what you want to do that you haven't done yet.
Yeah, so in addition to Project M, I've got Elevage Consulting. So, with Elevage, we advise people, and we also provide custom winemaking services. And so, and then at one point, to fund the business, we were doing a lot of bulk wine brokering, private label stuff. And so we were doing a lot of that stuff. And so, from a time standpoint, that has usually been more time consuming than growing Project M. And then originally it was a 2-person team. And then, Meg, my ex-wife, launched the Nasty Woman Project, and so it became 2 one-person teams. And we both agreed that the potential for Nasty Woman was probably greater, and that more of the resources should go to that. And it turns out there is no more Nasty Woman. So we were both. I don't know that we were wrong, that the potential was there. Just I think probably the energy ran out, whereas I have limitless energy for my outputs. And so Project M is in some years is maybe half my job, half the work. And so depending on the year. So I started making rosé. So if we talk about rosé, we go all the way back to the Patton Valley days. Patton Valley was the first producer to sort of make rosé that wasn't an afterthought. So people talk about intentional rosé. We invented it. We were the first people in Oregon to designate vineyard areas for rosé, farm it for rosé, harvest it for rosé, process it, make rosé, and it really took off. And so I would get, POs for the rosé before we picked it. It was totally nuts. And so I thought, well, but I always felt that there was a limitation to Pinot Noir as a rosé grape. And so when I launched Project M, I didn't have a boss. I could do whatever I wanted. So we initially made a still rosé, the Eclaira, the 2017 Eclaira. We made it in 16, but we bulked it out. The 17 Eclaira would be a non or multi-varietal blend because I wanted to bring in things to mitigate the limits or liabilities of Pinot Noir as a rosé grape. And so turns out it didn't work. People just didn't get the story, and it just didn't work. And so, and the objective with the rosé has always been, the idea is that we're working backwards. So all the other wines we make, like almost all the wines made in the world, there's a place, it's planted to a grape, and a winemaker makes a wine that refers back to the place in the grape. With the Eclaira, it was completely start at the end, start at the user experience, and then do everything else to get that user experience. We wanted people to have this, and we named it Eclaira. Eclaira was Latin for to make clear. So I wanted it to be about it makes clear we would release it in the spring. So, as the Oregon skies to make clear, but also wine that made clear the time that, the hell with everything else today. Now it's us and to do that. And so it didn't work, right? And so, but every year it was this idea of infinitely drinkable. So it was an opportunity to constantly iterate. What can we do to make it a little bit closer to infinitely drinkable? So I like to play games that have no end, like infinitely drinkable. And 2018, we thought, and what had recently developed in 2018 is that, we're just before, was at Castillo got their forced carbonation unit. So we were like, oh, well, we'll add bubbles to it. And so suddenly all these problems of varietal disappeared. Nobody cared. Once it had bubbles, nobody cared what grape it was made from. Nobody asked. The other thing we found was that one of the problems with rosé is if you're not sold out by Labor Day, people talk about rosé, oh, it's a year-round thing. For a winery, if you still have it in Labor Day, there's a sense of panic that overwhelms you. And if you have it after that, like you're now competing with yourself for your next vintage. Those problems completely disappear. Nobody cares about the vintage once you put a champagne cork in it. So once we started to carbonate it, all those problems disappeared. And I personally, I've never loved rosé. I've always thought they were these confused wines. Like, am I white? Am I red? You know, and so I've always pushed it in the white direction, and I just like it a lot more with bubbles in it. In fact, I'm trying to think the last time I drank a rosé that didn't have bubbles, and I can't remember. I don't really drink still rosés, and so for me, I felt like, why am I making it? Especially since I'm making this rosé that's quite good, but it's not gelling, the story's not going. So let's make it sparkling. So that's how the Eclaira started, and we started carbonating that in 2018. We've taken a few years off here and there because of sourcing issues, and then Riesling's been with us the whole time. We added Chardonnay in 2017. I saw there was an opportunity, less of a market opportunity, but more of a philosophic or creative opportunity with Chardonnay that I wanted to take on. I've liked the wines, but it's a tough sell. There's a lot of Chardonnay out there, too much Chardonnay. And so some years we don't make it because we made too much the previous year. But we've always, Pinot Noir every year. And then we added Pinot Blanc in 2023 was the first Pinot Blanc. I love making white wines. I love drinking white wines. If I could sell them, I would make 20 different white wines. I'd make 10 different Rieslings if I could sell it. Instead, we just make one. And it's hard to sell, and so that's the portfolio. And we might, I get to make other reds for clients, but I just haven't found another red grape that I have to make for Project M. Sometimes I start thinking about something, but it's never like compelling enough that I pull the trigger on it. Whereas, with the white grapes, I'm like making white wines, and I'm constantly cataloging sources. I've got a client that I make Sauvignon Blanc from the Applegate Valley, and right next to that block is a block of Vermentino. I'm like, maybe, that's more or less the portfolio. And then depending on the vintage, we'll make between 4 and 6 Pinot Noirs so far. We might do more of that as we grow. I don't know if we'll ever be Patricia Green making 22 different Pinot Noirs. I'm gonna let them own that particular title. Those wines are great, and I understand why they can make 22 different Pinot Noirs. I just don't have the attention span for that. Yeah.
You're making wine at the winemaker studio. Tell me about the experience.
So the Carlton Winemaker Studio, I think, if you look at the history of it, there was, there's a lot of stories about it. And we were at Archer in 2016, 2017. We moved to Methven, and I felt like what I figured out is if I have to share space, I want to share it with people that are as committed as I am. And I'm not convinced that was entirely the case at Methven. Some of the people there, I really liked the people at Methven, but it was also, Greg was very much like, do what's best for you. And I'm like, well, if we all do that, someone's getting the shaft, right? And so I can understand you don't want to be that guy. That's great. Whereas at the studio, Anthony King, who I think, I refer to him as St. Anthony. There is a special place in heaven for Anthony King for a variety of reasons, one of which is that he accommodates winemakers, which is not a job I would ever want. Like, one winemaker's one too many, and then so like 8 of us, you know, like, and Mel, who's there as well. So, you know, I'm at the studio because Anthony's at the studio. I wouldn't have even considered it an option had he not been there. And it's not to say that the people that had it before weren't competent. I'm a believer in Anthony King. And so coming from more chaos, well, you know, if we think about my time as being the only winemaker in a cellar and then going to the studio, you know, it's like a 3-month car accident, you know. It's just kind of like, but if we come back and we look at some of my other sort of multiple production spaces, they make an effort and are very good at managing it. And so, now that said, there's still a diversity of personalities in there. And again, I think you could probably just title this as disagreeable. And so I'm the disagreeable one. So so that's my lens when I view potential conflict, is that in a perfect world, 50% of this is you. In the real world, this is probably more like 80% you. So just move on and don't get fixated on this. And so it's really tough. It's really challenging. But the flip side is Anthony and Mel and former and current ownership have done such a good job of maintaining the bar of the producers there that one, it's a rising tide. And so, you know, people come in to taste 000 Chardonnay, they get to taste Project M Chardonnay. But at the same time, in addition to that, there's also, you know, I'm looking around, I'm seeing Win Peterson Nedry make Riesling. Okay, so, you know, her family's been making Riesling, you know, a long time at a high level. You know, like when Isabel and Lavinia were there, like watching Isabel make Chardonnay, like, okay, you know, like I'm a better winemaker because I've worked around arguably some of the best winemakers for a given varietal, and I feel that pressure, and I intentionally try to be competitive, not that I want to win, but because I'm better. If I'm trying to be better than the best, then I'm better than what I was before. And so it allows this, you know, I have sort of have the mindset that Kaizen is built into it. Constant improvement is built into the studio because of the other tenants, and it just makes me a better winemaker.
What's the future look like for Project M and for you? What's on your horizon?
So Project M, I've scaled back some of the consulting clients, and so I'm wanting to make more a go at it and really sort of see what like the Project M is exactly where I've been able to take it. And so can I take it further? And what do I need to do that, you know? And so for me, it's about the next acquisition, going from just me to somebody else, and who is that person and what role will they play, and figuring that out. And so at one point I had some contractors that were, you know, like I even do the bookkeeping now, you know, I've had contractors for bookkeeping. I had a marketing team out of the Philippines for a while, and it's sort of, you know, what I'm learning is that Project M is really me, but it's not going to go anywhere if it's just me. And so what I've been focusing on the last several years is refining the story down so that I can make it something somebody else can take ownership of, whether it's marketing or if they're, if I open a tasting room. So really refining that, getting that down, and defining everything, like really thinking much more deeply about, like for instance, when I had the marketing team, I remember I spent an entire week developing a document that talked about images and the kind of glasses that were appropriate. Like if you're making an offer for a red wine, don't show these kind of glasses. This is a glass, never show this, or bottles. Like if you're going to use stock imagery, I don't ever want to see a Bordeaux bottle. We don't bottle anything in a Bordeaux bottle. So just getting really, so that I can just hand this over. Here are the rules. Here's the thought, and then thinking about how to do that all along the way, and then trying to develop stories around how we want to work and who we are. Like for instance, for me, the idea of cardboard recycling. Like when do you break your box down? First of all, do you break your box down? If you're ever going to work for me, the answer is yes. You're going to break your box down. Like, and so for me, it's about one, accountability. That you're breaking down your box. You're not piling them up for somebody else to break down. I break down my boxes. I'm at the top. Everybody's going to break down their own box. When do you break down your box? You break it down now, because now's the time to break it down. And then it's about, why do we do that? Well, do we break them all down? No, maybe we save a few boxes because they're still useful. They're not waste yet. And then what do we do with our waste? Do we overfill the recycling container? No, we don't, because then the guy that's going to come get it has to get out, and we're more respectful of the people that are spending their time doing the things for us. So just like something like that, how do I create a story that tells who we are? Because I can make a list, that's not going to work. And so trying to think more about that, and then figuring out the things to focus on. Like what is the next thing that we ignore everything else to accomplish, and then we can add something to that. And so it's where Project M is right now. It's mostly in my head. We're making wines. We're trying to sell wines like everybody else. And then, just sort of also the creative vision, like what's that next Keros going to be? What's the next, are we going to add any more whites? What would the next white be? And then not just buying some white grapes and turn them into wine, but like what is the statement? What is the thing we can say about that? So I don't want to make a wine that's just to make a wine. Like if you look at everything we do, if we look at our Chardonnay, we're trying to provide a counterpoint to what is becoming what I call the cool kid style of Chardonnay. It's like, and they're great. I don't want to take anything away from them. I won't mention any of the producers, but I think we all know who they are. They're the ones that are defining Chardonnay. But I think there's, I see in those wines, there's a problem. And it's not that my wines don't have a problem. My wines have a lot of problems. But I see a problem that I want to take on. And so a lot of this is about, seeing problems with a wine. For instance, my Filament Vineyard Pinot Noir, we started working with Filament Vineyard, very low tannin, very high acid. And it was just like, I wish there was more tannic diversity here. I think a better structure. So we started to incorporate a whole cluster, not something I do. And so I had a problem and I implemented the solution. So I'm constantly looking to find problems. And then sometimes I just have to create them, and so that I can solve them. And so that's kind of what we do at Project M. Just look for problems to solve and look for problems to create, because there's no problem that exists that has a solution that we have. Maybe we have a solution, so we have to create a problem for it. So the Pinot Blanc is an example of that. Like I wanted to make a wine that was, I often joke that I like to make white wines that are like family reunions, lots of tension. And so like our Pinot Blanc is very much like that. And, I want it to stand out. I don't want to make a wine that's just like everybody else's. But at the same time, not be different to be different's sake. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I'm just saying there's a direction this could go in. Let's go there. And then I'll never retire if that's what you're, like I'll do this till I die, I think. One, because I'll have to, but because I know that as soon as I stop doing it, then I'm going to die. So the only shot at immortality is that I constantly make wine.
You're like a shark.
Yeah, exactly. I have to swim. I have to swim.
You've seen a lot of the growth of Oregon wine. You've been part of the industry for a lot of its growth. Tell me about where the industry is now, what it's like selling wine right now, what the industry looks like overall, and maybe where it's headed.
So, I mean, there's a lot there. The industry now is, I think it's at a very interesting point in the sense that I feel like the ground we're on has changed pretty dramatically. I think we, for a long time, ignored, the shrinking boomer, and I think very quickly there are fewer of them. So the rate at which they are passing has accelerated, but what I don't think we really anticipated was that aside from that, just their lifestyle changes. And so what we've done, and we never really I'm a Gen Xer, and we never really paid any attention to Gen X. And so, Gen X maybe not be an opportunity because we missed, we didn't get them when there was something still aspirational. And so now we've put all this pressure on, especially on Gen Z. Now, Gen Z is 28 years old, and I can tell you how much Oregon Pinot, I can count the bottles of wine, Oregon Pinot Noir I drank on one fist when I was 28 years old, 0. And so we're just, give them time, just give them a break, let them develop, and so, but to do that, like some brands have to go away or they have to shrink sales and so I think a lot of people are trying to find, unique ways, like the can, putting wine in a can. I love the fact that you're making wine more approachable. Project M's not going to do the can thing. It's not to say that I would never have something else that might be canned wines. I just, for me, like, there's something about, and I used to be so infuriated when people talk about like the romance of the cork versus screw cap, and I'd always joke, well, if the cork's the most romantic thing about the bottle, like your date is going to be really offended. But now here I am, like the old guy talking about, the romance of a bottle versus a can. But I think there is something to that. You don't share a can, you share a bottle. So we're finding these ways, different packaging. I think wine's become much more playful. I think we're moving away from sort of the way wine has traditionally been thought of, that it's about place, that again, there's a place planted to a grape, and a winemaker makes a thing that refers back to that place and that grape. I think it's not a bad thing that that's being sort of downgraded a little bit. I think, again, I don't use the word terroir because I think it's a loaded word, but I think if the sole purpose of a wine is to reflect the place it came from, it's a pretty small ambition. If we look at the role wine has played historically, like it was the inspiration for poets and painters and philosophers. They drank wine when they drafted the Constitution. This is something that is capable of so much more than just reflecting a place that it came from. And so that part of Project M views place as a tool to create beautiful things. That's what we want to do. But I think, in general, people are blending different grapes, from different regions and things like this. So I think place is becoming less. And thank God the younger generations aren't wanting to focus the conversation around the technical aspects of it, again, I think that's where wine lost its place as that drink of inspiration when we started to talk about it in, these reductionist ideas of Pinot Noir. It's this grape, it's on this slope with this soil, this pH, this alcohol, these barrels, this amount of time. This really came home to me. I was in Germany. I was reading a book about the making of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, and what's interesting thing about wine is that the language we use to sell wine is the same language we use to make it. Nobody else does that. So if you're trying to convince me that Miles Davis's Kind of Blue is a great album, you're not talking to me about, fifths and, B flats. You're talking to me about the space and the texture and the tone. And that's what we have to start doing with wine. That's what I want to talk about wine differently. I want to personify it. My tasting notes are oftentimes, describing it in terms of a human, or sometimes a setting. Like I might talk about fabrics, like drapes or something like that, because I think that's something you can understand. I don't know what 3.45 tastes like. It could be great, it could be bad. If it's a red wine at 3.45, if it's a Riesling at 3.45, no, thank you, And so it's not a terribly, the language we change. So I think the market is sort of forcing that upon us, and we've been very resistant to do that. It's also, I think the economy currently, but we've seen these economic blips. 2001. I was sort of born. My wine career was born in this malaise around the economy around that, and then 2008. That was the end of the world. The sky was falling, and we got through that. Then the pandemic, which actually turned out for the most part to be pretty good, but now I think we're seeing the backlash that people imbibed too much. And again, the pendulum swings, right? So we went from we're drinking every day. Like I would sell a couple, 4 bottles of wine. We'd do the virtual tasting, and at the end of the tasting, I would talk about, this one will be better tomorrow if you want to wait 2 days to finish that. And I can't tell you how many groups of 2 or 3 would be like, oh, these will all be done tonight, And so I think we're seeing the backlash to that, dry January, these things. And I'm not an enemy of dry January, but I guess my first thought is, if you feel like you have to take a whole month off, maybe you should just migrate a little bit more in the direction of, moderation the other 12 months of the year. But if you want to take a whole month off, that's fine. I'm with you. Excellent. In fact, I've got something for you come February 1st. But I think, like the consumer behavior's changing. Is it a permanent change? Is the pendulum stuck at an extreme, or is it going to come back? I think it will. I think eventually people that are 28 are going to want to drink nice wines. They're going to want to drink them out of a bottle with a cork, maybe a screw cap, and we'll be there for them. Again, it's this idea of the Lindy effect, that something that has existed for 10 years is more likely to exist for another 10 years than something that didn't. For example, bicycle versus car. Bicycles, there are more bicycles made every year. More people ride bicycles than drive cars in the worldwide. So that's the Lindy effect. It's an older technology that persists longer than a younger one. And so I think wine's the same way. It's been around for at least 3,000 years, probably longer. It's going to stick around. Project M, these brands may not. The region may change. Climate change is another inflection point. I think there's just a lot of things that are coming together all at the same time. And as the industry has grown and wineries have gotten bigger, they become more susceptible to these changes. If 50% of the population's drinking behavior changed dramatically, I could still sell all of my wines. I don't need 50% of the population. I need, way less than way less for Project M to thrive and even grow. And so the way I've always thought about Project M is I'm looking for 10,000 people. I'm looking for 10,000 people to drink 12 bottles a year. And if I can get to that point, I'm nowhere near that point, but if I can get to that point, then that's fine. And so I'm not looking for everybody. I'm not trying to be for everybody. And I think the brands and regions that are trying to be something for everybody are the ones that are suffering most, because nobody wants to be average. Everybody wants to be exceptional. They want to be thought of as they're exceptional. And if we make a wine just for them, then they get to feel that way. When we're trying to push them on something that's made for everybody, it's, you know, it's like a shirt. It's not going to fit. Yeah. But it's a challenging time. It's a tough time to be out there. Portland's always been tough to try to sell wine in Oregon. You know, it's like if you like the Warren Buffett idea of like the ideal business, you know, like a competitive advantages. We don't have that. You know, like I'm making Pinot Noir just like what 1,000 other brands in Oregon. We go to California, there's another 3,000 people making Pinot Noir there. You know, so there's no competitive moat. It's capital intensive. You know, money just sits around, not doing anything for long periods of time. It's a silly business to begin with, and so you either have to be passionate and willing to take pain for long periods of time, like Project M, or you got to be well-funded or really smart with money and accounting and things like that, which is not Project M. And you know, there's a place for both of those groups, but it's, you know, like you just can't be something for everybody. But Portland it's super competitive, so to try to sell wine there. And then I think the other development has been, you know, sort of natural wines. And, you know, I think, you know, I once made wines that were unfiltered and spontaneously fermented. All my Pinot Noirs are still spontaneously fermented. I let them go. I don't add yeast to them. And so, you know, but I feel like some of the attributes, so natural wine isn't about a process, it's become a style. And there are people that are making natural wines, or making wines naturally, I should say, that are exceptional wines. But I also think it's become a cover for a lack of mastery. For one, that's one of the things, you know, this idea of Kaizen. Every year I try to get a little better. This is a pursuit of mastery. My wines, 19 vintages before I started Project M. Like, that's how long it took me before I felt like I had the vision and the skill set to approach that vision, not obtain that vision, but to approach that vision. It took me 19 vintages to get there. Mastery plays heavily into what I think about. It's also what I want in my world. I want my furniture to be made by people that are masters. I want things that are made by people that are good at doing that. And I kind of feel like sometimes natural wine is a cover for a lack of mastery. And I think we've also seen a proliferation of brands as a result of that, that's, you know, the participation trophy, like, look what I did, you know, and it's not to say that some of those people that had 3 harvests and started a brand won't eventually develop that mastery, but they don't have it at that time, and I don't know that the market now demands that. And so that's the other thing that I think is going on as well. I think, you know, when I was in high school, if I wanted to be in a band, I had to learn to play the guitar. Now, you could be a DJ. On your phone, you could be producing music. By the end of the day, I could have an album put together, and I don't need any mastery to do that. And so, is that good or bad? I don't know. I know it's just very different than where I come from, and I think maybe that's the direction the market is going in. That they don't care that they're, you know, they would rather put their furniture together than have it made by a master craftsman. And I don't know if that's right or wrong. I just know that if you're a 20,000 case winery and you've been making wines in a certain way, the demand for that product may be diminishing because nobody cares that you're really good at making wine or really good at growing it. Yeah.
Last question for you. What is the best wine you've made?
Ooh. The best wine I've made. I'm not allowed to pick a favorite, right? Because they're like children. If they might, one of those wines that aren't one of the favorites might watch this, and then we're in trouble, right? So I think when I was at Patent Valley, the 2007 Lorna Marie Pinot Noir, really super tough vintage, and I just feel like we rose to the occasion in 2007, and the Lorna Marie bottling was like maybe 50 to 100 cases. It was the smallest production wine we did. And it was beautiful. And so I think it may not be the best wine I made, but I think in comparison to what that potential, that one would be a candidate. My 2016 Schlussel Riesling, I think that wine was really, I mean, it was just pure and precise, and yeah, it was a fantastic Riesling. Still is. I haven't had it in a while, but I still have some of it to see how those age. And that was a fantastic wine. Right now, I don't have the concept completed in terms of the name. I have the idea with the 2008 Keros. Is not 2008, excuse me, the 2024 Keros would be up there. But you're going to hear that a lot about 2024. It's like what I like about the really good vintages like that are that people that are less experienced will be like, wow, I really did this. I'm like, yeah, but everybody did that, And so, yeah, because I remember like 2008 was one where there were people that are like, oh man, we hit it out of the park. I'm like, you just had to step up to the plate, like you just had to take a swing, and I like tough vintages. I like difficult vintages. I think in that regard, 2019 Keros, the Axiom may have been one. And that was like that was a dissertation on my picking decisions. And then, right now, I think as a vintage, 2025 might be the best. At this stage, I keep going back and tasting the 25s to check myself. Like, are they this good? And I think because I scaled back some client work, and I was able to give those wines a focus that maybe I haven't in the past several years. So 25 might be, as an overall vintage, the best wines Project M has made so far. So yeah.
That's exciting to hear. That's good. That's great. All right, all the questions that I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that you're hoping to cover today?
No, I think I blabbered on long enough.
Yeah, we haven't had a good long one in a while. This was impressive.
How long have we been here?
Almost 3 hours. Going to be one of our longest interviews ever. This is pretty great.
I'm a windbag. I have a lot to say.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us today. Thanks for coming out and seeing us, and for the wine delivery. We appreciate that.
Yeah, if I knew there was two of you, I would have brought another bottle, so I'll see about getting another one to you. You guys can arm wrestle over it.
We'll find it out later.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and we're going to let you off the hook.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much.